now come to order. This is the March 26th, 2013 meeting of the Town of Fairfield Town Plan and Zoning Commission. We're going to begin by going into executive session. First item on the agenda, bills and communications, meeting minutes of March 12, 2013. I'll entertain a motion.
I'll move to approve.
Thank you. Commissioner Barrett has moved to approve. Commissioner Jacobson has seconded. Are there any additions, deletions, or corrections to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, all in favor of the minutes as presented. And I would note that Commissioner Alessi is on for Commissioner Kennelly tonight. All in favor of the minutes as presented signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions?
Abstain. I was absent.
Thank you. Commissioner Wagner has abstained.
I abstain as well. I was not present.
Thank you. Commissioner Suter has abstained. With the two abstentions, the minutes are still approved. Next item, new application to recommend to a public hearing. 2428 Eastern Turnpike, special exception application of Cambridge Manor Realty LLC for additions and alterations to an existing convalescent facility in an R3 zone. Mr. Wendt?
Yeah, this is existing Cambridge Manor Convalescent home on Eastern Turnpike. They have a couple of modest additions they are proposing. It is a special exception application. It does, by our regs, require public hearing.
Thank you. Is there a motion to refer this to public hearing?
So moved.
Commissioner Jacobs has moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Commissioner Wagner has seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of moving to public hearing, 2428 Eastern Turnpike, special exception application of Cambridge Manor Realty LLC for additions and alterations to an existing convalescent facility in an R3 zone, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Carries unanimously. We'll go to public hearing. Old business, 893 Sasco Hill Road, re-subdivision application of Bernard and Cynthia McDonald for 2 lots in a AAA zone. Public hearings were January 8th, January 22nd, February 26th, and March 12th. We have until May 16th to make a decision on this. The commissioners who were present for all the hearings were Commissioners LeClaire, Jacobs, Alessi, Parker, Jacobson, and I'm advised that Commissioner Barrett and Commissioner Wagner have listened to the tapes or watched the video. Is that correct?
Yes, I have listened to the tape for January 8th, which was the only one of the 4 hearings that I missed, so I've heard all the hearings.
Thank you.
Yeah, and indeed the one that I was absent for, I watched the video. When appropriate, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to propose a motion.
Sure. Now I'll entertain a motion now.
Well,
I'm sorry.
I again recuse myself from this matter.
Yes, thank you. And for the record, Commissioner Suter is recusing himself from this matter. So on this matter, we will have Commissioner Alessi on for Commissioner Kennelly and Commissioner Parker on for Commissioner Suter. Thank you, Commissioner Wagner.
Thanks. So I did view the tape for the one that I missed. This application is, I consider, very significant. There are many technical issues here that there are a couple things that I'd like to go back to, not only the tape that I viewed for the one that I missed, but also some things that I'd like to go back to on the ones I was at. And since we do have still some time to decide this application, I would move that we table this until the next meeting to give myself and others some more of an opportunity to assess the matter.
So motion is effectively to postpone till a date certain, the date certain being the next regular meeting of this commission.
Yes.
Is there a second? Thank you. Commissioner Parker is seconded. Any discussion on the motion to postpone to a date certain?
Well, I mean,
Commissioner Barrett?
if you feel you need more time to think on it, then I'm okay with it. I mean, the thing's already dragged out for 4 hearings, and I'm prepared to discuss it tonight, but if commissioners feel more time, we have time for it, so that's okay.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, the last hearing was the one that I unfortunately was out of town for.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at that hearing that the arguments were about the regulations and the technical, arguments in response to the parsing of the language and so forth.
Yeah.
There are other issues that I don't think that I need to identify specifically, but that I would like to go back to, and I think it's significant to the deliberations, so I would appreciate the support in putting this over to the next regular hearing.
Okay, I would support that then, Mr. Wagner.
Any further discussion?
I support it.
I would support it too. I would just note for the record that of the 4 hearings, the last, I think, was when all the pieces of the puzzle finally fit together, and we heard, and we received a number of documents from both the opponents and the proponents tying in the zoning regulation issue as well as the subdivision regulation issue or issues. And it started to make some sense as to what was being asked and what the opposition position was. So that's not unreasonable given the complexity of the issues presented on this one. This is an unusual matter, I think. So, all in favor, then? There is a motion to postpone till a date certain. We do have time. We have until May 16th to make a decision on this. The date certain being our next meeting, which will be April 9th? 10th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, April 9th. All in favor of the motion to postpone until April 9th, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, abstentions, unanimously is carried over to the April 9th meeting. Next item on the agenda, 85 Mill Plain Road, and the record should reflect that Commissioner Suter has rejoined us. 85 Mill Plain Road, zoning compliance application of 85 Pond Mill LLC for indoor recreation use with reduced parking and review of overall parking in the Design Industrial District. Public hearing was March 12, 2013. We have until May 2nd to make a decision. President Leclerc, Barretts, Jacobson, Alessi, Neely, and Parker. Commissioner Alessi is on for Commissioner Kennelly again on this matter. Mr. Wynn?
Mr.
Mr. Bocek,
Chairman,
I'm
just
sorry.
to refresh the Commission's memory on what was submitted, in fact, this is actually a 2-part application, as the Chairman mentioned. What was part of the presentation at the public hearing was an analysis of parking at the facility, and essentially what the Commission is being asked to do is reduce the overall parking ratio for recreational uses that have previously been approved at 3 spaces per 1,000, reduce that to 2.7 spaces per 1,000, which a portion, as you know, of the uses have been established under. Based on the information submitted and the analysis done, the applicant believes that the recent parking lot usage study in conjunction with the earlier study that was presented to the Commission warrants the reduction and respectfully request the Commission's approval of this. Now, as part of that request, and essentially what it did, if that request is not granted, the number of parking spaces available for the what space is left to rent is 0. So at that point, either a waiver would have to be applied for, or the Commission would have to do something else. So essentially, that's the reason for the request. As far as what the compliance application that's being requested, it's a new group of indoor recreational exercise operators interested in sharing 2,964 square feet of a previously approved top floor of a 3-story building at the front of this complex, and there were maps, needless to say, we had plans, the site plans, that indicated the building that's being discussed. Along with the existing 1,700 square foot Pilates studio, the new layout will include studio areas for which, such as Tai Chi, yoga, and other similar uses, which all will be sharing a common reception area and other areas of this space as originally approved by the Commission. As uses keeping with the other uses in the complex, they respectfully request the Commission approve this application, and again, approval of this application, along with our standard compliance issues, would also have to include the Commission, first of all, approving the adjusted parking ratio to 2.7 spaces per 1,000. And that, Mr. Chairman, was essentially what was presented at the public hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Devashik. Is there a motion on this item?
I would move to approve it. I don't know if we need separate motions on this, or just move to approve the application because it was
I
presented
would
together.
recommend separate,
Okay.
just because you have in the past.
Okay, well then I would move both to approve the reduced parking, the overall parking is the first one, and then for the compliance of the indoor recreational use. So I would move both of those things.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Commissioner Jacobson is seconded. Any discussion?
I have a question.
Yes, Commissioner.
Maybe for commissioners that were here when this was approved, or the staff. When this was originally designed, Was this the original square feet intended and amount of parking spots? I mean, how did it come to be that it went from all the way down to 2.7 per thousand?
Commissioner Barrett.
I could, well, you probably could better than I or the staff, but what it is, when it started, nothing was rented. So they started with like 5 per thousand, or whatever the requirement is, but just with the agreement that they would kind of see, based upon experience over the years, that there may be some other ratio. So then
Was
they
there
can,
a footprint for the building design, or was it?
You may.
I mean, was there a footprint for the building originally? Existing?
yeah, I mean, the building existed, they had so many parking spaces, and we could even see at the start, okay, well, at 5 per thousand, you're not, at 300 and some odd spaces, you're not gonna have enough, you're gonna run out, and they understood that. So then they started coming back to us with the individual applications, because it still was in the, development stages. A tenant would come in and they'd say, can we have reduced parking? And based upon experience, we started granting like 3 per thousand.
So we knew going in what the end goal was gonna be, where we were gonna wind up,
Not
pretty much.
entirely.
Not entirely, because we weren't, if it wasn't working, we wouldn't have done it. So at the beginning, we didn't say, oh, you can have 3 per thousand. So it's kind of worked its way to the end goal, but gradually, I would say, Commissioner Alessi.
Okay.
Ultimately, in the end, they had so much square foot and so much parking. I think they've added to the parking a little bit as we've gone along, also. I don't think they've changed the square footage of the entire buildings.
Right.
Go ahead, Mr. Glanch.
Commissioner Alessi, what you should understand is this building has always existed. It was a factory industrial assembly complex. And it is still actually in the industrial zone. What this commission did with this is, through a conversion with the industry leaving, the parking area essentially remained the same with some adjustment during construction. Actually, they eliminated or reduced the overall square footage on the property when they knocked down a few of the buildings that were there used for the industrial use. What the commission determined to do, as a matter of fact, they amended their regulations to address this, is instead of having on a case-by-case basis issues of retail and office space needing waivers for parking, because needless to say, office and retail space require more spaces than the industrial use did.
Right.
They amended the regulations to allow them, when appropriate, based on criteria that's listed in the regulations, to amend their parking ratio. What they felt was the appropriate way to do it here is to do it on a case-by-case basis, because what they felt, and based on the analysis that were received from the applicant, is as these uses were being added and approved by the commission, they could see practically how the parking ratio was working and whether or not there was any undue issues being created, traffic or otherwise. And at this point, this is pretty much finally filling up the building based on the analysis done to this point. It seems to be working at the 2.7, and that's essentially what the applicant's request is.
Thank you. Commissioner Wagner, did you?
No, that was on point.
Is there any further discussion by any member of the commission? Hearing none, all in favor of the matters involving 85 Mill Plain Road, zoning compliance application of 85 Pond Mill LLC for indoor recreation use with number 1, reduced parking, and 2, review of the overall parking. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Item carries unanimously. Next, go to the compliance calendar. We have one matter on for compliance, 1955 Black Rock Turnpike zoning compliance application of Man Meat Lamba for a food service use frozen yogurt in a portion of an existing building in a design commercial district. Mr. Wendt.
Okay, this is in Turnpike Shopping Center where ShopRite and other stores are. There's a audio stereo equipment store formerly next to J. Albert Johnson Jewelers. It's going out, and they're looking to establish a frozen yogurt store here. There's 2,000 square feet of gross floor area in the space, which translates to the ability to create 400 square feet of net patron space. The floor plan before you shows 400 square feet, so it's a wash as far as the parking numbers are concerned pursuant to our regulation. So it's basically simply a change in use from an existing retail space within the shopping center to a food service use, that being a frozen yogurt store.
Thank you. Is there a motion on this?
I'll move to approve it.
Thank you. Commissioner Barrett has moved to approve. Is there a second? Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Commissioner Jacobs.
question to staff is, how much, or will there be much indoor dining there? Any outdoor dining? Anything else that's going to add to the parking other than a square footage swap out?
Well, yes, there's some seating, and the seating is limited to an area of 400 square feet. I don't know how many seats exactly they're showing on the plan.
They have 2 tables, it looks like.
Yeah, I would,
4.
again, that entire area of 400 square feet that's shown could, under our regs, have tables. They're not proposing any outdoor seating under this application. Should they wish to do that, they'd have to come back before.
Do they have adequate parking for the 400 square feet?
Yes, the 2,000 square feet gross retail translates to 10, a credit of 10 parking spaces, if you will, and you need 1 parking space for every 40 square feet of patrons, so that gives them an allowance of up to 400 square feet. So yes, there will be tables and chairs within that 400 square feet.
It's a knockoff of 16 handles, basically. So they have 14. Any further discussion by Commissioner Alessi?
Like you said, it's like a 16 handles. And what's in 16 handles? A lot of kids on a Friday and Saturday night. So I just want everybody to make sure that, we're all on page with the way the paving has been done with the correct pedestrian walkways in this parking lot before we put a kid-friendly place in here, where kids are gonna be running in and out of this place.
That's correct. If you look at the plans, I would have thought this was 16 handles, except there's 14 handles. Literally, there's 7 machines and 2 handles, and they've got the same topping area, the same 2 cash registers, it looks identical to 16 handles downtown.
Oh yeah,
except
there's
one
4
less
or
machine.
5
So,
chains of this type of stuff that are of similar design.
so that's a good question. Is we're satisfied with the flow in that parking lot, or is that something we should take up, given that we know what type of clientele it's going to generate and the nature of the clientele with people drop-off pickups.
Drop-off,
And kids,
pickups,
yeah.
We're looking at any other ice cream place or yoga place that we have in town, and we know what the crowds are like in the summertime.
Right.
Thank Barry.
Commissioner Suter and then Commissioner Jacobson.
I would just say the parking lot seems to me to always have adequate empty spaces, and I don't think it's going to impact the parking in any significant way. So I think we could go ahead and approve it.
Commissioner Jacobson?
I agree. That parking lot is crowded. It is dangerous. There is no adequate pedestrian crossway on it, and it is going to attract a lot of drivers. So I have concerns over it. It's different from the retail store.
Commissioner Barrett and then Commissioner Jacobson.
I agree with in principle, the swap out of the spaces is the same. Also, the parking lot, yeah, it isn't always full. And I don't know about looking at, the hours of operation. These times when these yogurt-type places that draw people are usually in the evening. A lot of the other retail stores, I don't know what their hours of operation. Certainly ShopRite is still open in the evening, so I guess my concern wouldn't be so much about parking. It would just be, if people have concerns about the pedestrian flow in there, or, how people are going to just walk in there or get in and out. Because I know we've had some concerns about that parking lot in the past. But as far as the parking, I agree with Mr. Suter. I don't really have concerns about the adequacy of the parking. Maybe the parking lot itself, but not the parking.
Commissioner Jacobson?
That parking lot, in my opinion, has gotten worse and worse with each addition to the building. And they've tried to squeeze as much in as possible. My concern or my question is, because we don't like the flow of the parking, do we by that point have the ability to deny for that reason? And I'm not quite sure on that. If they meet our other regulations, as they say, be denial under health and safety. It would be what would be the reason for denial. That's the question that I see on it. It's just, this is a parking lot that has gotten progressively worse each step. And nothing is making it better. The addition of the drive-through bank was the major reason for the parking to get even worse. They lost a bunch of parking spaces, they took out the queuing aisle by the traffic light, and when we had that hearing, there was a discussion on the southernmost apron having too high an arc, which they said they were going to look at, and I'm sure they went out and looked at it, and that's all they did, was, there it is, fine, they looked. So that has never been addressed also, that apron, from that previous hearing. I just don't know where we would go for a denial on this.
Mr. Devention?
Yeah, Mr. Went is going to, also, if you remember, part of the discussion on a past improvement to the building was that there was some improvements done for pedestrian access in the parking lot to address similar issues that you're mentioning now in the past. Those things have been implemented. It is what it is as far as the parking area itself, but there has been improvements made for pedestrian access. Again, the times I've been up there, I haven't seen any problems. There's no question that certain times, depending on what day of the week it is or what holiday is about to descend on us, it is more crowded, like any other retail plaza that we have with multiple users. To be frank, though, to Mr. Jacobs' question, the area required for patron area, the parking number is there. I mean, based on the 1 to 40 square feet, that's the number of parking spaces. The number of parking spaces are there. Needless to say, if that patron area expands or if an outdoor seating proposal comes in front of you, absolutely, then the parking becomes an issue because they're at the number that's required. Other than that, in general, there is no proposal or necessary at this point adjustments to the parking area for this use. It's replacing what was an existing use. And there were improvements done based on your requirements for pedestrian circulation. So I would argue it is better than it was. I don't know, I mean, is it perfect or is there still some issues? I would assume there is. It's kind of a irony because a commercial plaza like this, if it's going to survive and do well, it's going to be crowded sometimes. But it's the best I could say as far as. I just wanted to refresh your memory that there were.
Well, I just want to refer you to the plan that's in your pack. There's three noted pedestrian walkways that they have established on this property. I don't know where you would put an additional one if you were to do so. It would lose, you'd have to eliminate parking spaces to accomplish that.
Commissioner Sitter?
Yeah, my own experience in the parking lot is that the ShopRite half of the lot is much busier than the other half of the parking lot, with the possible exception of the Webster Bank window, which is on the far end of the building, and I think only affects the far exit. Also, I think it should be kept in mind that the lot in general is rather shallow, and the shallowness of the lot, that is the distance between the storefronts and the street, I think contributes to the queuing problem at the exit which goes by the traffic light there, and that's something that affects the entire plaza, not just any particular store. And thirdly, there is a covered walkway by the stores in the half of the parking lot where the other retail stores are, and it seems to me that's fairly wide. So I don't see, at least at this point in time, the safety problem that Mr. Alessi sees, but perhaps other people might have a different opinion.
Commissioner Jacobs?
Directed to staff again, is it that we now, or are we about to propose if I remember correctly, 150 square feet of outdoor dining with no additional parking requirements?
No, that's been approved, but
So
it's-
they can come back and get their outdoor dining with no additional parking requirements?
Well, subject to your approval, if you think there's adequate area for them to conduct that business on the property.
Yeah, that's a great example of the way it's written, that if, in fact, you don't feel there's enough parking for it, you can deny it.
Or if you think it's going to obstruct too much of that walkway that Mr. Suter just referenced, you've got some discretion there. It won't demand any additional parking up to 150 square feet, but that doesn't mean it still doesn't need your approval.
that is one of the changes we made in the new regs that came into effect end of last year, beginning of this year, 28.6.12. Restaurants, taverns, diners, cafes, bars, nightclubs, and dance halls. One space for each 40 feet of patron floor area or portion thereof, except no additional parking is required for the first 150 square feet of seasonal outdoor dining area approved by the Commission through a zoning compliance application. So we do have jurisdiction, should they come back for seasonal dining, to address that issue, seasonal outdoor dining, to address that issue at that time. Is there any further discussion on this application? Hearing none, all in favor of compliance application of 1955 Black Rock Turnpike, zoning compliance application of Man Meat Lamba for a food service use frozen yogurt in a portion of an existing building in a design commercial district, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Commissioner Alessi? Abstentions? Item carries 6-1-0. At this point, we will stand in brief recess and come back to the public hearing. There's 3 items on public hearing. 185 Thorpe Street zone change application, zoning regulation amendment of 185 Thorpe Street Corp. and 185 Thorpe Street special permit and coastal sign plan application. We will stand in brief recess. Meeting is back in session. Again, this is the March 26, 2013 meeting of the Town of Fairfield Town Plan and Zoning Commission. We're beginning the public hearing portion of the meeting. We have 3 items on public hearing this evening. The first is 185 Thorpe Street, zone change application of 185 Thorpe Street Corp. to establish a designed residence district on land presently zoned designed industrial district. Number 2, a zoning regulation amendment, application of 185 Thorpe Street Corp. to amend sections 10.7.2 and 10.2 of the zoning regulations, and 185 Thorpe Street special permit and coastal site plan application of 185 Thorpe Street Corp. pertaining to a 65-unit residential development. What we will do is consider all 3 of them at the same time. And just note for the record that we did receive some additional documentation tonight, specifically late this afternoon an email came in from Laura Pooley, the town engineer, at 3:36 p.m., which was distributed to the commission at the start of the meeting. We also had a letter from Mr. Stanky on behalf of the Conservation Commission, which you should all receive, which are part of the record as well. To the members of the public that are here, I'll let you know how the meeting proceeds tonight. We begin with the applicant. The applicant, through their counsel, and any other witnesses they see fit to call, will do a presentation regarding all 3 of these applications. The commission can ask any questions as the application proceeds and the applicant presents testimony. When we're done with the application and the presentation by the applicant, we go to any members of the public who wish to speak. I'll call you all up one at a time. You'll have an opportunity to address the commission. You don't have an opportunity, though, to cross-examine or ask questions of the applicant. If you feel there are any questions that should be answered, just tell us, the commissioners, what you believe those questions are. We'll have the opportunity later, should we see fit and necessary, to ask the applicant those questions. Upon conclusion of public comment, we go back to the applicant for any final comments, and then we'll close the public hearing. We won't vote on the item tonight, assuming we finish within our deadline. We have an 11 o'clock strict curfew. Wherever we are, we stop at 11 o'clock, so you can plan your nights accordingly. If we must continue, we'll continue in 2 weeks. Our next regular meeting, where we take evidence on applications, is April 9th. So again, with that being said, we'll begin with Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, ladies and gentlemen.
But I always do this to Mr. Fallon. I apologize. I'm going to interrupt already. Faster than usual. I should have asked you this a moment ago. We did receive a supplemental set of plans. I just want to clarify for the record.
Right.
A large set of plans were received March 21st by the Planning and Zoning Office.
Right.
If you could just let us know how those correspond to the small working set that we are provided, whether they replace them, just so we're all looking at the right documents as we go tonight during your presentation.
Mr. Jobst submitted the revised plans as of March 21st to address matters that he had discussed with the engineering department, and he will detail those changes. Before we start our presentation, after some opening remarks by me, in addition to having the boards, I have individual packages for each of the commissioners with all the exhibits will be up here, because that'll make it easier for you to follow, plus you can take them home. Within those packages are the revised plans of March 21st.
So we should not try to follow along this Osprey
And
land.
you'll, within a matter of moments, have a new working set, and I would, those sets, you can do what you want with. But some of it will be redundant, but the plans, in terms of the engineering, will be new.
I just want to be clear, so we're looking at the right documents.
The other thing that I mentioned to Mr. Wendt, as long as we're just doing a little housekeeping, and I'll put it out so the commissioners could be considering it in their minds, I do have a conflict on April 9th. I have a major hearing in Bridgeport, and I don't want to put the commission in a position where I'm trying to be two places at once, because I don't know exactly what time that matter will be scheduled, but perhaps if we don't close tonight, we could address that before we
That's fine.
adjourn.
Fair enough.
So good evening. For the record, I'm John Fallon. I'm here representing the applicant tonight, the 185 Thorpe Street Corporation. With me, on behalf of the corporation tonight, are Mr. Terry McClinch and Mr. Ernie Pearson. Terry is, of course, a Fairfield longtime resident and has owned the subject property through the corporation for many, many decades, and we'll talk about that a little bit tonight as well. What we're seeking approval here with regard to these applications is the construction of a 65-unit residential community known as Osprey Landing on the property, and you'll be hearing a lot about that tonight. Let me give you a few thoughts in terms of the property that's involved now. It's 6.67 acres, and as you probably know, and we'll have photographs for you, it contains several large buildings, a garage, an annex building, and an asphalt parking area. In fact, 95% of the site, that's 6.3 acres, is totally impervious as of today's date. It obviously has been used as zoned for industrial uses for many, many years, and this is not, as you will also hear tonight in our presentation, enhanced the adjacent tidal marsh and tidal wetlands. There is currently on the site no provision for any stormwater management, as we would expect. The current zone, as I indicated, is the design industrial district. You all know, and the record would indicate, that the permitted uses under section 21.2 there include manufacturing, warehousing, bus depots, freight yards, trucking terminals, car rental businesses, contractor storage yards, and the like. And in fact, as I said before, this property has historically been used for industrial purposes. For many years, it was Fairfield Lumber, which was a commercial and industrial lumber yard, and most recently it has been and is the site of United Rental, storage and maintenance of heavy construction equipment. Our proposal, in its essence, does a number of very beneficial things. Number one, we're going to remove the existing buildings and the asphalt parking lot. We're going to construct the residential community, Osprey Landing, which I spoke of. In doing that, we're going to reduce the impervious area on the site from 6.3 acres to 2.4 acres. We're going to reduce existing coverage, as your regulations define it, from 34.1% to 24.9%. You'll hear testimony tonight about the state-of-the-art stormwater management system that we're going to install. That's going to include the installation of rain gardens, the purpose of which is to cleanse water runoff through a strong biofiltration system. Bob Jontos of Land Tech is here tonight. He has been our environmental consultant on this project for the many years we've been working on it. And he will talk about what we're accomplishing here by way of creating a transitional environment between the estuarine conditions of the adjacent Pine Creek and the developed site, all at a site now that has no such provision for any such water management. And the last thing that's part of that application and the environmental is that we are proposing a significant area of pedestrian public access throughout this property that will basically, and in fact link portions of Pine Creek between Rugby Park, which is a lovely little park if you haven't been there, and Thorpe Street itself, thereby creating an open space linkage between those residential areas in the vicinity of Pine Creek and Rugby Park, all the way out to the commercial area of the Post Road. We have received numerous prior approvals as we come before you tonight. We did receive the unanimous approval of the Inland Wetlands Agency and have Inland Wetlands Permit 2011-1205. We did receive yesterday, as you did, Mr. Stanky's letter We will be addressing the contents of his letter within and part of our proposal so that we can address the concerns that he raises there. The commission, acting as a conservation commission, if you examine their minutes, basically had a limited matter of consideration, and that was suggesting that you should deny the application unless or until you were provided with a plan for the cleanup of the adjacent town property. Now, we will address that in detail tonight. I would point out that Mr. Stanky's memorandum, written on behalf of the commission, does take a somewhat broader scope than the motion adopted by the commission on February 21st, I think it was, does. But having said that, to the extent the issues that he would raise would be things that the commission, your commission, would want to have some response to, we do intend to respond. But we do have a unanimously granted inland wetlands permit. We also have a certificate of permission from the Connecticut DEEP for the work that's associated with this project under their jurisdiction. We also have a stormwater management permit from the DEEP. We did receive, as you did this afternoon, the engineering report from Ms. Pooley. As you received it at 3:26, we probably received it right around the same time. We haven't had a careful opportunity to review it yet, but we will certainly do that. We have been working constructively and collaboratively with the engineering department. That was the reason that the revised plans that the chairman referenced before were submitted, and we're confident that the requirements that are ultimately opposed by the engineering department, and of course with your endorsement, are certainly matters that we'll constructively work to respond to. Now, the applications as indicated in the call are 3 or 4, depending how you count them. There is the application to amend the zone map to change the zone of this property to design industrial, from design industrial to design residence. There's the application for certain text amendments of section 10.7 and 10.12 of the regulations, the essence of which, as you can see when you've reviewed it, is to make certain modifications to the requirements of the design residential district standards where the underlying property is designed industrial. There's the special permit and site plan application, and as part of that, there's the coastal area management site plan review. I'd like to just say a few words before I introduce our team to talk to you about the project, about the zone change aspects here, because that certainly falls within legal purview. Obviously, you have to look at the consistency of what is proposed by way of the zone change in terms of the town plan of development. And where you look to that is at the town plan of conservation and development. A few citations to that document I think are highly relevant to the zone change. In reference to the center area at section 11.3.10 of the Plan of Conservation and Development, it says, and I quote, "Creation of a transitional zone for multifamily housing to stem the spread of business uses into residential neighborhoods." You'll hear me repeat a number of times, this is a classically Hornbook situation of a really transitional site. We have the heart of our center design business district on the one hand. We have lovely neighborhoods, basically single family, some two family, but residential neighborhoods around us. And then in the middle of it, you have what I think is a somewhat historically aberrational heavy industrial zone. I think multifamily housing, as you provide for under the design residence district, is an absolutely wonderful transition with regard to that commercial retail business area and the residential area that abuts the property elsewhere. And I think the town plan of conservation and development speaks to that. The town plan at page 40, that reference to the center area, by the way, is found at page 42. At page 43, it states housing development may be an appropriate alternative in the area between the Turnpike and the railroad if and when existing commercial use is no longer viable. Well, here it's not so much existing commercial use is no longer viable, but I would suggest to you that the existing industrial use is not so viable and maybe isn't so desirable in terms of the overall area that we're talking about. At page 43, it's also stated additional housing opportunities in the center should be encouraged through the existing mixed-use provisions of the zoning regulation. This isn't a mixed-use project, but it's a project that accomplishes the same thing because it provides a sort of residential vitality, as I'll talk about, proximate to our center district, and at the same time affords a good transition to the single-family residential areas. Section Roman numeral 3.3 talks about the goals, some of the goals in the plan, and those include housing-related goals that involve: 1, housing opportunities for people of all ages, creeds, races, incomes, and physical disabilities should be encouraged, and I'll talk about that in a second. Diversification of housing accommodations for the many individual desires of our population, and I'll come back to that in a second. Utilization of the design residential district as a transition from commercial uses to single-family residential uses, and I've already commented about that. So I think there are numerous examples in the Town Plan of Conservation and Development which indicates that the proposal, which is embodied in these applications before you tonight with regard to Osprey Landing, is very consistent with these expressed aspirations of the Town Plan of Conservation and Development, and in fact will provide a substantial benefit to the community as a whole, and in this area in particular. Let me talk about that, if I can, for a minute. And I talk about it because I'm in the sort of area where this type of housing is most in demand. I'm 63 years old. I know it's hard to believe. I guess I'll tell you I was 73. But I have numerous peers every day, because of maybe what I do, who come up to me and say, empty nesters, wanting to downsize, but wanting to stay in Fairfield. Where's the product? There is not much product of that kind. There's Greenfield Hunt, there's a few other places, but by and large, those empty nester peers of mine, and maybe some of yours, end up going to Trumbull or Oxford or Stratford or wherever, looking for this type of housing. And when they leave, they take their tax dollars with them, they take their commercial spending dollars with them, they take their volunteer hours with them, they take their long-term commitments and participation in the community with them. They don't want to do that. It's not in the town's interest that they do that. You received a letter from the Affordable Housing Committee. I have great respect for Steve and that committee. No one denies, certainly not this commission, that there's a need for affordable housing in the town of Fairfield. But there are also other housing needs for, as the Plan of Conservation says, the diverse market interests that are out there. And Osprey Landing, this absolutely addresses one of those concerns. I told the client when we first started doing this too many years ago that I'll personally sell 15 of these. And he's going to try to hold me to that, I'm sure. But the fact I was trying to make is there is a great demand for this kind of housing in the town of Fairfield among people who want to stay residents to the town and downsize. And this addresses that. And because it addresses that without an affordable component doesn't mean it shouldn't be addressed. There are certainly projects and developments and parcels and strategies that should be employed to ensure that we continue to promote affordable housing. But there is also a place in this community, for the reasons that I've stated, for market housing, market rate housing of this kind. Our presentation tonight, very overviewed. I'm going to have Walter Jopes of the Huntington Company talk to you about the existing conditions, which I've sort of touched on, but he'll elaborate on, and our proposed site plan, talking specifically about our provisions for drainage and water quality improvement. I'm then going to ask Bob Jontos from Land Tech to in fact talk about in greater depth what I referenced, and that is our mitigation and restoration plan for this site and our plan for public access. Attorney Barbara Miller, who I'll introduce with proper introduction when her time comes, who's been our lead attorney and environmental attorney on this project, along with Tim Carr, our environmental consultant, will discuss with you the remediation plan that we've proposed, how it's going to be phased during the development process. I'm then going to ask Guy Horvath, our architect, to walk you through the architectural design plan and the exterior elevations. We'll also present you with a landscaping plan overview. We're very proud of the landscaping plan. And then I'm going to have Michael Galante of Frederick B. Clark and Associates talk to you about the traffic report and analysis that's been submitted and the considerations that we applied in preparing that report. So with that, let me introduce Mr. Jobst, and as I do, I will provide you, ladies and gentlemen, with the requested packages. And again, as I said, these are basically, in the order of presentation, we would hope and expect, the exhibit boards that you will be seeing tonight.
Is it the same? Same thing. Okay, thank you. I think you want an extra for staff, maybe.
Good evening. My name is Walter Jobst. I'm a licensed professional engineer and land surveyor in the state of Connecticut. I'm employed by the Huntington Company, which has offices here in Fairfield. First, I would like to discuss the existing conditions. You can see on this map, I've got two colors, brown and gray. Gray is the asphalt, brown's the buildings, and that's pretty much the site. It's, as John said, it's about 6.7 acres. It's zoned design industrial. There's a slope to it from the north, gentle slope, basically from north, northwest, south to southeast. As I said, we have several large buildings and a large paved parking area. We have on the easterly side and on the westerly side, two ditches and creeks that are tidally influenced and experience the ebb and flow of the tide. We have a sanitary sewer which enters our site in two locations. One is on Thorpe Street and comes into northerly section of our site and then turns westerly and ties into the sanitary sewer in Francis and Bungalow Avenue. There's a 21-inch trunk line that traverses Francis Avenue to the east to the intersection with Bungalow. Then that enters our site and then takes a turn and goes to the southeast, bisecting our site through the salt marsh on the south of our site and eventually ties into the sanitary sewer in River Wayne Street. Presently, there is no stormwater management system on the site. Basically, all the runoff is sheet flow off of the asphalt. There's a few scattered catch basins here and there on the site, but they don't do a lot. There's no cleansing of the runoff, no detention of the runoff. It just pretty much rains and it runs off eventually to the south into the salt marsh.
Mr. Jobst, if I could, while you're on this one, I understand that you've got the batteries here. You've got the line coming in on Thorpe Street, which then goes over to Bungalow and Francis.
The sanitary sewer line
Sanitary
comes
sewer.
in here.
And then it flows back across the property again to a southeasterly direction off the site. There's also another, it looks like another line from Granville going down to Beaumont or the Park, Wrigley, or
This
what is that?
this is a storm drain
Storm.
that comes down Granville and goes along the westerly side of our property and feeds that tidal ditch to the southwesterly corner of our property.
Is that a storm drain for on-site stormwater, or is that coming,
That's coming from off-site.
So it's pulling the Granville Street drains?
It comes up eventually from Post
Post Road.
Road and traverses through our site.
Now, your site, am I correct, you obviously have access on Thorpe Street. The Bungalow and Granville both have...
We have also
termination-
frontage on those two
There's frontage
streets.
on those two? You don't have any frontage on Beaumont when it makes the turn at all, correct? I think Beaumont, does Beaumont end dead ends? I guess if you go down Beaumont by the old divorce, it either goes straight and stops... or
Beaumont
it's straight up to the
continues
right.
and goes straight up to, and parallels Granville Street straight up to...
When you're
Post
coming
Road.
in from where divorce used to be, Beaumont, I know you get to the bottom and there's another Beaumont Place or Beaumont Terrace.
Beaumont
goes to the
Place
right.
that comes off to the west.
Correct, but if
Dead
you
end.
keep going straight, does it dead end onto
Right
your
here.
property or onto the, right?
Is it
Do you have access to Beaumont there, or is
dead
it,
ends
no, wait,
into the
Commissioner Neely, hold on, I have to ask this. Does Beaumont dead end onto
Beaumont
your
comes
client's
down and dead
property
ends
or
to,
onto town property?
to the west of our corner.
So you don't have access to
So
Beaumont?
we do not have access to
No.
Beaumont.
Okay.
Now, this corner here touches on the park, what is it, Rugby Park down here.
And the lines you've drawn in on the southernmost portion, I know you've got the gray. Does the gray represent what you have fee title to, the portion of the property?
Gray represents what is paved today.
What is paved? And there appears to be double property lines, if I'm not mistaken, on the southerly side? Why are there three lines, three solid lines coming through the... One of them is just below that building, and then there's two of them that parallel each other.
This is the southerly property line of our parcel.
Okay, and what are the next... That's your southerly property line. What is...
Then there's a fence line here that the pavement goes up to.
Okay.
And then this dotted line is the delineation of the tidal wetlands.
Not the dotted line, but below your fence line, there's another dark line that appears to parallel, and almost identical, from Beaumont all the way up to... Let me show you what I'm talking... This is your property line here. And I'm talking about these two. What are these two lines here all the way up?
That line is the mistake line.
The mistake line?
Did you say mistake?
Mistake.
Appreciate your honesty.
That's actually, it should have been erased before I printed those up. That's actually a 10-foot offset of the tidal wetland delineation. So it's really nothing.
I think you got us all confused now. sir.
Yeah, I did that on purpose so you'd have a question to ask, because I know you would have no questions.
Well, I'm sure we have
On the
questions.
drawings in front of us, there are two dotted lines.
Right.
Which one is correct?
The most southerly one, the one on the bottom.
So,
And sorry about that.
So the most southerly line is the inland wetlands line?
No,
No.
tidal wetland line.
The tidal wetlands line. The fence line is the very faint...
Very faint and has little X's, but you probably can't see it because it's too small.
And on this map, the fence line is to the north of the tidal wetland line?
Correct.
And it's right at the edge of what's the gray, the pavement area, so the
Correct.
fence is at the edge of the pavement. We ignore the next line going north, which is the mistake line. And then the property line is another, whatever number of feet north of that.
Correct.
It's quite an encroachment. Right now, okay.
Encroachment? What encroachment?
The parking lot on the town property. Okay.
Town property, that's right.
While you're looking at these lines, the 10-year flood line,
Yes.
which I see where
Here.
I'm looking at the big plan there, but it also seems to be continued over there. Is the entire site 10-year floodplain?
The entire site is within the FEMA 100-year floodplain.
100 years.
Yes.
And the 10-year is
10 years,
just-
the lower portion of the site, basically everything below, on the old data, everything below 8.9, I think it is.
Commissioner Alessi, or Commissioner Wagner, I'm sorry, Commissioner Wagner, you had a question, and then Commissioner Jacobs.
you mentioned that the fence
That was
is
working.
within, on the other side of the tidal line,
The fence is on the upland side of the tidal wetland line.
north of it,
Correct.
where it makes a sort of 45-degree turn up to the right. Yeah. Am I reading this correctly? The fence line actually goes...
Crosses over that
Yeah.
delineation and then kind of they zigzag back and forth with each other along the easterly boundary.
So the fence line there is in the tidal area and on town property.
Correct.
And if I could just, for the record, John, clarify one thing, which we will get into during the course of the proceedings, but I just want to make it clear at the outset. The fence and the encroachment area was not established by the applicant, and as best as we can tell, the fence and the encroachment area has existed, as you see it now, late 30s, early 1940s. And we'll address that further, but I just want to make it clear at the outset that this is a condition that we didn't create, including the fence. It's been there, as you see it, the fence and the asphalting, for as best we can tell, upwards of 65 years.
Just so that we know to whom to pose the questions, who from your team is going to address the encroachment and the remediation on town property and all that stuff?
Attorney Miller and Mr. Carr, all to come in due course.
Thank you.
Mr. Jacobs?
Can you address the height around the site above sea level?
Pardon me?
The height above sea level in different areas in the site.
To the south part of our site, the topography varies from about elevation 3 to elevation 6 in some areas. As we proceed north, the grade goes up. We're up around elevation 9 in the northwest corner, and also 9, 10 up in the northeast corner. So we're low down here at 3, working our way up to about 9 or 10 at the north end of the property.
And where will you have the people go when we have our next storm and that is all underwater?
Well, this area is protected. I guess I might as well answer it now. I was going to address that later on in my comments. We had a study done 3-4 years ago by Dr. Frank Bowen from the University of Connecticut. He spent a month or more with tide gauges, recording the tidal flow within this salt marsh area, Pine Creek area, Oldfield Road, down in there to establish a 1-year spring high tide level. Now, everywhere else in town, that elevation is 5.8. He established here that because of the tide gates and other structures south of us that regulate the ebb and flow of the tide in this area, that 1-year flood tide was elevation 3.6. He said, okay, we'll call it 4.0. So the 1-year spring tide in this area for this site is 4.0 rather than the typical 5.8. That information then we use to go to the DEEP to establish their jurisdiction, which they said anything that you're doing below that elevation, we have jurisdiction. Anything above that, we do not. So even though this is where it gets hairy, by FEMA's delineation, this is within a 100-year floodplain by statute, by their maps. From a practical standpoint, what you're going to experience here is something completely different. This does not get inundated to the extent that you would think based on FEMA's designation.
Just if I make one, I'm looking now, but we will, before we close, make part of your record. We actually sent out a photographer the day after Hurricane Sandy, and we have photographs, and the site was dry. There was a little area ponding in one spot, but...
That event, first of all, I'll address, you were talking about a moon tide as your tidal flow. In a storm, you have breaching. Breaching means water goes over the barrier island. Your floodgates don't work at that point when water goes over a barrier island and it is breached. That's one. Two, the storm we had very little rain. You've got a situation where when you have a storm with a lot of rain, the watersheds are bringing water down, the barrier island is being breached on the other spot, you're in the middle. So what happened in the last storm is not indicative of what could happen in the next storm. And what you just said with your study has nothing to do with the storm and has to do with the moon tide, which is your highest tide that you will get in any moon cycle. So I say again, knowing those, moon tide, fine, but when we get the next storm and we have a large rain event, water coming down the watershed, breaching of the barrier island, you're in the middle, where are the people going?
The other thing I want to point out to that, and it's certainly a topic we could continue to discuss, we do have 2 permits after exhaustive review from the DEP for this project, and you also have, and we're all going to be looking at it, the comments of your own town engineering department. And obviously a primary consideration of theirs, among other things, would certainly be that. So we're comfortable that, and Walter can certainly respond, and I want him to elaborate, but I would want to point out that this project has been thoroughly vetted by the Inland Wetlands Agency, the Town Engineering Department, and the DEP, and permits have been granted, and you have the report from the Engineering Department, which I haven't read yet, but I'm comfortable with whatever it says.
Commissioner Suter?
Yeah, I was just going to ask what the impact of Sandy was, and he's answered that.
Yeah, we had some minor ponding in the very low portion of the site, which is down in this area here.
Commissioner Parker has a question.
I have a question for you. Where you're intending to install the crested weirs in that bank area you're going, you have those at 4.5 feet, is that correct?
Top of the weir is about
Is that- are you
5.5.
Are you filling up to that level?
Would be cuts and fill, depending on the existing topography. I'll address that
Okay.
later.
Mr. Jobs, could you address something else? You know, what tributaries feed the marsh area, if you will? I know when we drive on Old Field Road, we cross the little bridge before Mona Terrace going to the east. You look to your left, that's the body of water, and I assume the tide gate is over there someplace. So we know that marsh area is obviously feeding up. Does the Mill River at all, are there any pipes of any rivers
This feeding is within let's see, what do I have here? This is in the Pine Creek watershed. Mill River is...
Mill River is to the west, but are there any other bodies of water that have been piped in this area that are, just like, you know, the water by my house is fed by the Mill River and the harbor both?
This pipe,
Yeah, I was gonna say.
let's see, this creek here, there's another pipe here which runs up behind the properties on Thorpe Street to the Post Road, crosses the Post Road, it continues northerly to just the west side of Ludlow. And all that drainage within that area gets...
Behind the Carrollton's picking up that water up there?
Right.
And the Carrollton.
You can't.
And then your site drains into it as well. There are the pipes that are sticking out there.
Well, our site drain, we don't have any pipes draining into that. Our site drains presently by sheet flow. So this pipe goes all the way up to eventually by Ludlow High School.
Is that just picking up storm drainage off the Ludlow site, basically, or is that picking up an actual stream of some type? Or
I think there's a detention basin that was constructed at Ludlow when they did the renovations.
The one by the highway with this bridge?
Yeah, and I think that
That
drainage
pipe-
goes
that
into this
pipe goes-
pipe
okay.
eventually. There's not a stream per se that this is piped.
If you folks go to the middle school, he's talking about behind the new Ludlow Middle School, if you walk,
Behind that and behind Carrollton
you walk
Hospital
that way,
on the
there's
town property.
a little bit of open space there, you can, body of water. Okay, thank you.
Now, our proposal is to demolish all of the existing buildings, remove the asphalt pavement on our site, construct 14 buildings, which will encompass 64 condominium units. There's an existing house here, which will be refurbished and become the 65th condominium unit. We will have a driveway servicing the site coming off of Thorpe Street, coming down and around. It'll end in a cul-de-sac at Granville Street and the west side of our property. At Granville Street, we'll provide a pathway for emergency access and then a breakaway chain and gate in here to
allow only emergency vehicles access to the site from that point. Now, the drive, we propose to be constructed of porous pavement, and I'll get into that a little bit later. The driveway aprons to each of the units will be asphalt or concrete. We haven't determined that yet.
Mr. Jones, just to pause you, Commissioner Wagner has a question.
Thanks. You mentioned a cul-de-sac on the northwest Granville Street there. So, can you explain how that complies with our regulations around number of dwellings on a cul-de-sac?
Well, this is not a public street. This is a private drive. So I'm assuming you're thinking of
Yeah.
10 lots on a street, on a dead-end street.
Right.
Well, this is not a street. This is a private drive servicing the unit, so
Your subdivision
that-
regs would not be
that's not applicable.
Not
It's a
applicable.
multifamily, I mean, by that standard, Woodfield Village, this is
Right.
a design residence district multifamily, so it's
Got
not
it.
a
So that because it's, all sort of a gated community of sorts, then those regulations don't apply.
And I don't want to jump ahead of Mr. Galante's presentation, but obviously, we looked at all aspects early on, access and the options we had and what would be, and we had a number of neighborhood meetings, 3, I think? 2, okay, 2 at the library. And then we consulted with the police and the fire department, and I want to make that clear.
Yeah.
Relative to that. So this has been something that's been vetted with them as well.
So your position would be that our assessment should be based on traffic flow and site engineering based on just general sense of health, safety, and welfare?
All the things you would normally bring to bear, but the provisions of the subdivision regulations concerning lots for a subdivision on a street and cul-de-sacs aren't applicable here, and haven't ever been in terms of our multifamily residential developments around town.
Thank you.
If this is a private street, where's the public access you referenced?
Coming off of Thorpe Street, that'll be our public access.
Onto your private street?
Well, it's not a street, it's really a driveway. This is the public access for this entity of condominiums. This is a drive to access all of the different units. It's not really a street.
So, I mean, is there a proposal in the town is getting an easement over this, what I'll call it a private drive, if that's the right phrase, private drive? There was a reference made at the beginning, why I asked is there was a reference made at the beginning that there was going to be public access from Rugby Park to Thorpe Street. I guess the question is, if this is not a street being deeded over to this.
What you're referring to is
That's walking.
the pedestrian.
It's pedestrian.
It's the pedestrian
It's
access.
pedestrian access.
It's not on your street then?
No, Mr. Jontos will show you exactly where it runs. It's actually much nicer than being on the street.
Rugby's over here.
But Mr. Jontos will address that in his comment.
This dark brown line here, which will be constructed on top of our berm, is going to be the public access, pedestrian access walkway. At this point, it'll access Rugby Park.
And what is that a gazebo or something, this thing?
That's just a landscape amenity. Probably have some benches around there so you can sit and watch the osprey or whatever.
Is that a paved structure of some type? The whole walkway?
The whole walkway, so basically stone walkway.
Okay. Commissioner Canali.
Thanks, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. This might be better directed at Mr. Fallon, but if you know the answer, Mr. Jobs. The pedestrian access, that's appealing. My question is I don't think it's required by town law. What would it be the case if some of the unit owners or renters didn't like having people traipsing along outside? In future years, would there be any kind of, or would you be willing to accept as a condition of approval some sort of agreement between the town and the 99 years perpetuity that this pedestrian area had to be maintained for the public? You would be okay.
The answer is yes. A couple of points. First of all, the entire aspect of that will be disclosed in the condominium documents, so that anybody buying will know. And if that's off-putting to them, they will not buy the unit. And certainly we have no objection. But more importantly than that, that provision for public access at that location is part of the DEEP approval, and was part of the mitigator package, as Mr. Jontos would describe it, that the DEEP approves because of their title jurisdiction. So there will be no alternative on the part of the association in years to come to backtrack off of that. It's mandated already by the state.
Now, no, in those approvals, do they also include any kind of signage that points out to the public this public access is available? The reason I mention this is because years ago, as a reporter, I remember covering the Hudson Riverfront Walkway, which was a private-public partnership along the Hudson River Walkway there. And at first, it was embraced by developers in the initial years, but over time, what was done was essentially not to put up gates or anything, but just to essentially kind of de-emphasize it, that there was never any kind of clear signage or something. So I'm wondering, is anything like that, clear signage that the public knows that this is not a private area that they might feel uncomfortable going by if they didn't know they were entitled to it? Is that part of the DEEP agreement?
I'm not sure. I'll have Mr. Jontos address it, but I'll say for the record, if it is not,
You'd be willing to accept it as a
it would be a
condition?
condition of approval of the zoning, because we have every intention. We think one of the things that is most attractive about this is the public access because of the linkage it provides, not only to our residents, but other people. And so we'd be very happy to ensure that that is highly noticed.
Yeah, obviously, and that the other thing to answer your question, that public access area is going to be subject, and you can say this for your record too, to a recorded public access easement that'll go on the land record. So again, there'll be no opportunity for a subsequent board or group of homeowners to say, you know, we're not so crazy about this. It will be in perpetuity.
Mr. Farrell, I'm not going too far because Commissioner Barrett has a question, but let me just ask Mr. Jobs one question while you're here. We're going to disrupt your entire flow tonight. You're used to it.
No, I should have started out with, are there any questions?
It's always good to have an active commission. You talked about some type of a crushed stone for the access way.
Yes.
You know, you've
walkway.
designed, I know, an intricate system here. In the event this commission wanted to make a condition that it not be crushed stone, but it be some type of maybe a pervious pavement, so one could turn it into a bike area where it's hard to ride on stone, but, you know, imagine if this was approved, kids coming from the rugby park in those neighborhoods, South Pine Creek, wanting to pedal downtown. Can we substitute from stone a pervious pavement and not affect, maybe that's Mr. Jontos, not affect the drainage or the design of this? If someone could talk about that at some point, not necessarily, that's fine.
I'm afraid Mr. Jobs is going to have a nervous breakdown.
Oh, too late.
Mr. Jontos will make note of that question, Mr. Jontos, and address that.
I will give Mr. Jobs a break now because Commissioner Barrett has a question to Mr. Fallon.
I could have a nervous breakdown too.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really on point of what Mr. Job, it's an overall question. It's not really on point to what Mr.
I think it's a fundamental question to the application, though, that is interesting here.
Yeah, because just in terms of the 65 units, and I know you have a regulation change, but just in terms of the 65 units, could you just explain, Mr. Fowler, like where in our section 10 is that really allowed for this property? Like if I read 10, 6, 7, and I'm not sure if this is within a half mile of 95 of the train station, we actually allow it, I think, 17 per acre, but the parcels are restricted to 4 acres, and this is 6.3.
No, I have, if you have the regulations, if I could just see your regulations.
Yeah, sure. And then 10.6.8, it says it's restricted to a 10 per acre, and again, if this is 6.3, just how do you get 63 or 65 when I'm figuring 63? I just wonder how you get to the number of units allowed.
Look at that one, Mr. Jobs to speak. Right.
He can, yeah, you can
Yeah,
take
you
your
want to
time
look at that, we got
I'm just
Mr.
trying to give
Jobs.
Mr. Jobs a break, yeah.
That's fine.
I'll go ahead and I'll do that.
Yep, sure.
Your break's over, Mr. Jobs.
Where was I? Oh, yes. As part of our proposal, we are going to implement a state-of-the-art stormwater management system, and this system will be a multi-tiered system. It'll include, as I said, porous pavement for the main drive, construction of rain gardens, which will be dispersed throughout the site. We'll have some sediment structures, and we'll have construction of a bio-detention retention recharge swale. How's that for a mouthful? And all of that has been designed within this project so that we can make substantial improvements to the stormwater quality and quantity as it now comes off the site.
Commissioner Parker and then
Yeah,
Commissioner Alessi.
in terms of dumping into the stream on the eastern border there, when I was on the site, I took some photographs of these pipes that clearly drain into the ditch on the
From our-
side. And that's coming out from under the property.
Those will all be removed when we start construction for
But
the
what are
building.
they draining?
I think they're draining probably roof drains for this structure, which is coming down. So that, they'll become non-functional once we start construction on the site.
Okay.
The driveway, which is porous pavement, will receive not only the rainfall from what lands on it, the driveway aprons will be pitched toward that, and runoff from the roofs at the front will also be pitched toward that. So all of the runoff within this area will be directed toward the porous pavement, and it'll infiltrate through that and into the underlying ground system. We'll have zero runoff from those areas. We will also have
Mr.
several...
Which map number are you looking at, just so we can go to our books?
This is C4.
Thank you. And Commissioner Jacobs has a question.
With your porous pavement, is there going to be a maintenance schedule on that?
Oh, yes.
You have something set up?
Yes.
Because if you don't maintain it, it will not remain porous.
It don't work. No, there absolutely will be a maintenance schedule implemented and probably become part of the condominium documents so that everybody is aware that this is something that needs to be done on an annual basis. However often we tell them to do it.
Wagner?
The chain link fence that we talked about earlier shows on the as-built map. Is that going to remain, or is that going to be removed?
This portion down here
Yeah.
will remain. It's on town property.
So is the asphalt.
That's correct. That'll also remain.
Was that based on a
I'm sorry,
discussion with
did you
the
say,
town?
that's not, I don't see any asphalt on this map C4.
There is. There is. If you look.
Can I, please?
Sorry.
No, yeah, only the
It's here. It's not highlighted on this. I didn't color this asphalt in because we're not doing anything south of our property line.
So you're gonna excavate and remediate that property, but you're not gonna...
From this property line to the north. That'll be addressed later on in the presentation.
Is that based on a discussion with the town that you're leaving the asphalt encroachment and the fence
That will
put
be
on top
addressed
of
by
it?
Attorney Miller.
Attorney Miller will address that?
Rain gardens. These darker green areas in between these buildings are rain gardens. They'll receive whatever runoff comes from the lawn areas into that. They will, you probably in the large plans have details, probably in land text plan there's details of what that cross-section will look like. And it's designed to cleanse, renovate runoff, allow it to infiltrate into the ground and become part of the groundwater system. The last link in the stormwater treatment train is the detention recharge swale, which runs pretty much along the down gradient side of all of the buildings along this easterly and southerly boundary of our property.
So it's that dark green line?
This is this darker green area here. That's that swale. Again, this was designed to attenuate peak stormwater flows, allow for groundwater infiltration, and for renovation and cleansing of the stormwater runoff. Now, we chose this option for a number of reasons. One in particular was to disperse the runoff in a sheet flow and disperse it over the site rather than several different point sources that you would normally get with a pipe where you don't have the opportunity for groundwater infiltration or detention or cleansing. With a pipe, it would just flow and be on its merry way as it is.
What are you proposing is going to happen? If I look at the drawing, specifically the transition area planting scheme, which is another, I think it's in our packet, it's the page that you're looking at. What I'm assuming is you've got the walkway next to the swale area that goes down.
Correct.
And then it goes back up to another planting, a transition zone, and then you're going to go, as you go to the south, into the paved area that's going to remain. The water then will be accumulating in that dipped area next to the walkway.
Correct.
Correct. Where will that water flow, or will it disperse itself? Is it going to be closed at the ends in a contained system, or is it going to be open to the marsh or to the park area?
Well, what our proposal is, this bioswale, flat bottom, it's at elevation 4. We have 2 weirs proposed, one in this area and one...
2 what?
Weirs, like dams. Overflow weirs.
Are you keeping the same elevation through the entire length? Because I know you said the property goes up. Is it going to have...
This will all be...
It's a berm.
The bottom of the swale will be at elevation 4. The top of the berm will be at 5.5. And the pedestrian walk will sit on top of that. Now, we have 2 weirs here. Again, Bob Jontas will go into a little bit more on the makeup of that that swale, what materials are in there. Basically, this will collect any additional runoff that doesn't get infiltrated into the ground by the porous pavement, detain it there, clean it as it goes through the vegetation that we're planting in the site. We'll have groundwater infiltration on 80 to 90% of the storm events, which are usually 1 inch or less. On a larger storm, as it ponds more within this swale, we'll get some discharge over those weirs. Worst case, a 25-year storm, we'll have maybe 2 to 3 inches going over this easterly swale.
Just so I'm clear, you talked about the elevation of being 3 to 6 now in the southern portion of the site. That makes sense with the swale, the way you designed it. On the northeast corner by Thorpe Street, with an elevation of 9 to 10, are you cutting the site down to keep, that bike path or the pedestrian path is going to be at 5? Or are you going to have 4 feet higher? Is the property going to be 4 feet higher than you come down to the path?
It all slopes this, we have it's 9 or 10 up here, but it slopes down this way. So along this portion of the site, we're up about elevation 6 in here, so there'll probably be a little bit of a knoll. We'll cut it down on our property. Over here, it's around 3, so we'll have a little bit of fill for that berm. Above that, in here, we're all pretty much around 4 or 5. No, actually 4. So it'll be a little bit of fill for the berm, a little bit of cut for the swale.
So you have a slope both to the south and to the east, essentially, towards the marsh.
Right. It all slopes this way and this
and
way.
that way. Okay.
Into that salt marsh.
Commissioner Wagner has a question, then Commissioner Jacobs.
So the berm on the southwest side is going to be at elevation 4? Is that right?
No.
No.
The berm for its entire length
Yep.
will be at 5.5.
5.5, okay.
The bottom of the swale for its entire length will be at 4.
Got it. So now, at the top on Francis Street, just below where the existing properties are located, it says proposed stockade fence. Do you see that?
Yes.
Right. That's the dark line that surrounds the property.
That'll be screening between us and the neighbors on Francis Street.
Does that proposed stockade fence, that black line, just continues all the way around? It also appears on the bottom.
It's hard to tell on that what's property line. Yes, because you have stockade fence here.
Yeah.
So it comes around here and around here, which will screen off, and it comes over to here.
Does it where your pen is now on the left-hand side, the top left, right there, does it now come down? Does it flow south?
It comes down to about this point here.
And does the fence stop there?
The new one will. Presently, there's fencing all along here. There is an existing stockade fence.
Yeah.
That is in this area right now. There's some fencing in here. What we will do is construct on our side of the property line, a new stockade fence. Some of this fencing is this side and then that side of the property line. We're going to put up a brand-new fence along the whole thing, screening, make it look nice.
Okay, and then, so on the west side of the property, is there similarly going to be fencing?
There will be no stockade fence along there. There's I think right now there's existing chain link fence on our property that will be removed.
And then...
And this cleaned up in there.
So now along the southerly aspect of the property, along that walking path, will there be a fence there as well? No. That's going to be open?
That's going to be open.
To the estuary?
Correct. So you have that nice vista to the south.
Right. And then all the way up to the eastern part. Is there going to be fencing on the eastern side of the property?
This here, no.
Okay.
So basically, pretty much between our site and the adjoining residences will be a stockade fence. Here, where it abuts the salt marsh, there will not be.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Jacobs has a question.
Can you address the plantings in the swale? In that swale that runs along, can you address the plantings? You've got a salt marsh to the south.
Bob Jontos will address that.
I'm assuming
that's above my pay grade.
Most of the time it's probably brackish. And then you've got fresh water in the swale from runoff. And you're going to have plantings that are going to be able to withstand fresh and salt.
That's what I'm led to believe. But Mr. Jontos will answer that question. I have a brown thumb. Anything I propose is going to die immediately, so they don't even ask me. Okay, let's see, where was I? We talked about the bioswale, providing attenuation to peak storm flows, providing renovation, groundwater infiltration. We were made aware of a conflict on this weir with some grades to the south. So we are proposing to take just this weir from a weir height of 4.5 feet up to 4.8 feet. And the ramifications of that is there is more detention on site provided and less discharge from the site. So for practical purposes, it really doesn't change, it certainly doesn't change the design of the design intent of the bioswale and its function. It's tweaked a little bit and it's still going to work the same way, only a little bit better.
Mr. Jobs, for the commission, is a weir basically an overflow like a dam, or is it something more like a tide gate that can be controlled? One can control the flow and it prevents a backflow.
Depends on how you design it. These are...
How are you designing this one?
These are more like a dam. So it's a solid structure in place. When this fills up enough, water will spill over the top of that and discharge away, and then eventually when the remainder infiltrates into the ground, the swale will be dry.
Some dams have adjustments where you can open up the valve, as you know, to open a gate below
Right.
if you wanted to manually drain. You're not having anything
I'm not
like
having
that,
anything
right?
like that. These are permanent, fixed elevations.
Are these weirs constructed of a man-made material like concrete, or are they
Yes.
more like a berm? No, so they are, because
I think somewhere
but it is in
all of that,
points.
there's a-
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed that. Okay, so they just are,
Yeah,
so
and
it's
that'll-
man-made material, it's
Yes.
not soils or something like
Right.
that.
Commissioner Parker?
I know it's not much of a threat here in terms of seismic activity, but were there an event, how about liquefaction with the filling?
Our geotech expert be better to address that. In addition to The Weir conflict, there was a mention made that regarding the side slopes of the swale being at 2.1, when in fact 2 years ago maybe they were that way. Based on our geotech's report and his comments that the slope should be at a 4-to-1 on the north side of the berm and at a 3-to-1 on the south side of the berm. We had made those changes months ago, and they are reflected on the new plans also. So in through this area, particularly this area, where there'll be a surcharge taking place, which will be addressed later on in the presentation, we meet that criteria. Up in here, the slopes are a little bit steeper, but this is a more stable area and not as critical to have that little bit of a flatter slope, which we have in here. So we've adjusted our site plan and our grading based on the geotech suggestions last fall and adhere to those side slopes.
Mr. Jobs, could you address the Granville Street gate? Is that within your bailiwick to talk about that gate, the construction, the purpose, how it...
Well, we haven't, I have no particulars on what it's going to be, but it will be a substantial structure that will be locked at all times. Access, whether it's a key code or a key or some electronic thing, will be provided to the town, fire and police department, so that if they need to have emergency access here, they'll have the ability to open up this gate and get access here. Otherwise, it'll be permanently closed and locked so that there's no traffic from our site onto Granville Street.
So then the condition of approval will be, maybe this is better for Mr. Fallon, it's only for police or fire access, not for your snow removal or a moving truck wants to fit in or a trailer truck can't make the turn up door.
Correct. That is the purpose. It's emergency access for
as far as our peak flow attenuation on our site, like I said, the porous pavement, the rain gardens, the bioswale, we had several criteria that we considered and based our design on. One was the frequency of storm events, which is a storm event of 1 inch or less, which is 80 to 90% of the annual storm event occurrence, will be retained on site. That was part of our design criteria. We also analyzed our detention based on Conservation's Commission's criteria, which is you take the 10-year post-development storm and reduce it to the 2-year pre-development rate, which we have done. And lastly, we have the criteria that is recommended by the DEP's Stormwater Quality Manual, where you take the 2-year post-development peak flows, reduce them to the 1-year pre-development flows, which we have done. And in all other aspects, we are in compliance with the recommendations for the DEP. That's within the engineering report, if somebody is brave enough to want to read that. As far as FEMA goes, we will be in compliance. There's new regs going to be coming around in July of this year. We've anticipated that, and all of our design criteria as far as structures and whatnot comply with those new regulations, which will be adopted this summer. And we've analyzed peak flows for all storms and have a substantial reduction post-development compared to pre-development. This one I don't think you have, so I'll go back to the engineering plan, which is C2, and I want to talk about the sanitary sewers. As I said before, we have a 10-inch line coming in off of Thorpe Street to the center of our property, then heads westerly to the intersection of Francis and Bungalow. We have an 8-inch line coming down Bungalow, and we have that 21-inch trunk line coming in to this intersection, and then coming and bisecting our site through the center here. Now, we've been in contact with Sewer Department, their review company, and the Town Engineering Department, and have discussed this over the course of developing these plans. Our latest discussions with them were that we would abandon this 10-inch line that feeds Thorpe Street, construct a new sanitary sanitary line, a 10-inch line, and connect to a new manhole, which we will construct over the existing trunk line, and then we will run a parallel 21-inch trunk line up from that point to Francis and Bungalow. The reason we're running a parallel line is so that we can keep the existing trunk line functioning while construction is going on. Once construction is completed and we've made the connection, that old 21-inch line will be abandoned. There's some question as to, clogging and settling and the integrity of that pipe along that area. In our discussions with Town Engineering Department and Sewer, we had offered that that portion of it would be replaced. This portion that's existing will remain, and later on in the presentation you'll hear how construction will take place to maintain that integrity.
I just want to emphasize, not to interrupt Walt, but that's a significant benefit to the town. This is a town existing sewer line that serves segments of the community in the neighborhood now. And in our conversations, which have been ongoing for a long time with the engineering department, the sewer department, and the town sewer outside consultant, there were concerns about the existing capacities and whatnot of the existing lines serving, neighborhoods, so that without blowing our own horn too much, one of the byproducts here, and I'm sure it's addressed, and we'll be looking at the engineering memo, is what Walter just said. We're upgrading that town line. So I just want to make it clear, this is not some sewer line that we're installing to serve this project. It's an existing town line that serves areas adjacent to us and will be upgraded as part of this project.
Yeah. Commissioner Wagner, then Commissioner Alessi.
If I could just make one statement before I take your question. The new plans that were submitted on the 21st, I think, a few minor tweak items, very minor in nature. The major revision on those plans is this sanitary sewer construction, the abandonment of this line, the new 10-inch line that we're putting for Thorpe Street. That's the bulk of that revision, with a few minor tweaks with building location, a little tweak on grading. That's why we submitted new plans, because of that change.
The 21-inch line.
The 21-inch line.
The 21-inch line.
Well, the 21-inch line here and this 10-inch line, which we're going to abandon and reroute in a different location.
Commissioner Wagner, Commissioner Alessi.
So when you calculate the sewer requirements for a property like this with this planned build-out, do you look at number of bedrooms or number of people, or
Usually it's based on a bedroom count in public health code. When you're designing septic systems for a system like this, they have X number of gallons per bedroom, because you have a certain expectation of occupancy of those bedrooms, 2 people or 1 person or something like that.
Right.
So it would be on so many gallons per day per bedroom.
So what are those metrics for this property? Do you know? Number of bedrooms, number of people expected per dwelling unit?
You have 65 units. I'm going to guess half of them are 2-bedroom units. The remainder are 1-bedrooms. So, but over the daily usage spread over a 24-hour period are minimal when compared to the flows that this 21-inch pipe now takes and can take. So our impact from our site on that system is minimal.
But from your perspective, in terms of sewer, you didn't calculate number of people, number of residents, per...
Not specifically, because...
Sewer department,
did in their review.
They did in their review, so this is, that was part and parcel of review with engineering and the upgrade, but they
And-
clearly...
and their
this is
consultants.
reviewed by, as the sewer department and their consultants, and they're very comfortable with it, and appreciative of the improvements we're making.
Sure, and I can appreciate that, and my questions were not designed to challenge whether the system was capable of handling the sewage, but from your perspective, whether there were any calculations done about the number of residents for the property as a whole that were expected, or per unit?
I didn't do calculations per se, but based on my, I hate to say it, 40 years of experience,
Yeah.
I have a feel for, what we're going to need. I mean, typically you'd have an 8-inch pipe, but because of site constraints and grades, our piping throughout the site is going to be a 10-inch diameter pipe, just
Okay.
because that's
Yeah.
what it's going to require.
Now, there was a comment in Mr. Stenke's letter, which we just got, which I haven't had a chance to digest. It's quite technical. But there was something about the replacement of the pipe being in some unsettled ground.
That will be addressed later on in the presentation by our geotech experts.
Thank you.
We did submit, by the way, it is voluminous, but Mr. Wendt and Mr. Demonchik, we submitted the geotech report. It's about this big, and Overflow Weirs, who is the author of that report, is here tonight, so he'll be able to answer any questions or respond to any public comments, including Mr. Stanky's, with regard to geotechnical issues. But I want to make it clear that the record, I don't think Mr. Wendt burdened you each with a copy of that report, but I think he has 2 or 3 copies for your reading pleasure. And it's,
I dare say, as thick as my engineering report is, that dwarfs mine.
Do you have an electronic copy of that?
do we have an electronic, or could that be sent electronically? Yes.
If you can send one to the staff, they'll forward it to the commissioners so we can read it on our own.
Just forward a copy of it electronically to Mr. Wendt. Although he's got hard copies, but that way they'll have.
I was going to do Jerry, and then you.
Oh.
Jerry, Joan, and Jim.
Okay.
What's currently on the site now? Is there any storm drainage system, piping, nothing? Everything is just running off?
Yes, everything is sheet flow. There's a few catch basins in some low areas with 6-inch plastic pipes that drain, but for the most part,
Where are they draining from?
They're draining...
They're draining out.
This ditch off of our site. For the most part, there is no storm drainage plan for the site.
So right now, you
It's
got,
all-
pretty
it's all
much you got
sheet flow.
100% runoff right now?
Yes, absolutely,
Okay.
100% runoff.
Okay.
Thank you. Commissioner Neely and then Commissioner Kennelly.
You just mentioned there are 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom units, but you're showing 3-bedroom units.
They're all 2-bedroom units.
They're all what?
2-bedroom.
They're all 2-bedroom units.
Well, why do you show 3 bedrooms here?
You're going to have Mr. Horvath will talk about the interior layout in a moment.
Okay, I just didn't understand.
Yeah.
They were showing 3 bedrooms.
I obviously misspoke, which my son, the architect, tells me I do all the time.
Mr. Horvath will review the interior floor plans and the delineation of the space.
Mr. Fallon, can I show one quick thing, because you just mentioned this, this amenity, the 21-inch trunk line being added as an amenity for the town. I did note here that in some of the correspondence, it mentions that the replacement of this portion of the trunk line will eliminate the necessity of long-term monitoring, annual reports, and the posting of a bond to cover same. In other words, the trunk line in place would free up the property owners from having to do that.
That's certainly our hope and our intention, but
Right.
we'll have to review the engineering department recommendations that we all received this morning.
Right, sure.
And then they may,
Still exist.
They may still have some aspects of that, and we'll have to resolve that with them.
Yeah.
But that was our desire.
Thank you, Commissioner.
To that
Wagner.
point, it wasn't that there won't be monitoring necessary. I think the recommendation was that for at least, quote-unquote, say 5 years, that monitoring programs be in place,
Yeah,
right?
and my quick read of that, and it was very quick.
Yeah,
but
mine
it's
too.
4 o'clock, was, I think that's correct, and I think it also left the door open for, a discussion with engineering in terms of final definition of the monitoring and any bonding, which we will intend to obviously do, because we've been working collaboratively, as I said, with the engineering
Yeah.
department for the better part of a year on this.
Sure,
So I'm
but,
sure we
I
can
mean,
resolve
as of today, that's not finalized. I mean, that is an open issue as to the final construction and the requirements, post-construction, monitoring and maintenance, and who's gonna take care of what and
It's
so.
correct, our anticipation.
This was
and-
from Mr. Jobs.
Right.
That
Our
that's,
anticipation
you
based
expected
upon the-
not have to post a
Right.
bond, not to have to do monitoring.
Right. That was
That's
our-
my point. It's
that
just
was our
that's what you
anticipation.
guys believe
Correct.
this will lead to.
And that was
Correct.
based upon meetings and conversations that we had, but, communications can be subtle, and to the extent that there is statements in the report we all received at 4 o'clock today, my only, what I would say is, we will certainly resolve that with engineering. Okay?
Any other questions?
It's an open issue.
Walter, be across the street at the restaurant, drink, available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Joe.
They'll do whatever they want.
Before I
It's like-
introduce Mr. Jontas, I just wanted to cover the question that Commissioner Barrett's raised. If you look, Commissioner, and I think I stole your red. so
You
sorry
did,
for you.
that's okay.
But
I know him by heart.
If you look at section... If you look at section 10.6,
Yeah.
starting on page 31, I know that what you used to have here was you had 10.1, 10.61 through 10.66, as you still do.
Yes.
Which always talked about minimum lot area and maximum density, depending on the underlying zone.
Yes.
What you had before the Stonegate amendment, if you flip over to page 32, what is now section 10.6.8 used to be section 10.6.7. And for some reason, because I guess they thought it flowed better, when the Stonegate amendment, which is the present 10.6.7 came in, they pushed the other one down. Long-windedly, that's because it's that what is now 10.6.8 that's applicable here. That if it's not a residentially zoned parcel, then 1 acre and the maximum density is 10 units an acre. So that we're clear, I talked before, I said the entire site was 6.7 acres. I did refer to 6.3 as being
Oh,
paved, so that may have thrown you off.
that's what threw me
The
off, yeah.
entire site is 6.7 acres.
6.7 would,
So
okay,
we're
that
flowing.
was...
Okay.
Excuse me, can you please speak into the speaker, because we can't hear him? And can you please turn the map?
Sir,
You're out of order.
sir, you're out of order, number one. Number two is we are the zoning commission. We need to see the map. If you want to see the map, stand over there. Don't interrupt the commission during a hearing.
Can you talk into the mic?
The mic's not going to amplify. The mic is for recording purposes. If you want to sit closer, if you have trouble hearing, come on up front. We can make accommodations if you want to sit closer, you can hear him.
try to talk louder.
But these aren't gonna-
I've
these
never
aren't-
been accused of not talking too loud. But,
Okay,
so that's the answer.
so 10.68 applies, and I understand.
And we have
6.3,
6.7
you have
acres.
6.7.
And 65
units.
units.
Okay, I have, I don't want to,
Did he give you your regs back?
yeah, he did give me my regs back. Is there any part in your presentation besides, because I know we're going to hear about traffic and more from engineering and conservation issues. Is there anything we're going to talk about the text amendment itself? Because I have questions specifically about the regulations. And
Sure. I think what I'd like to do to, as they say, keep the flow going,
Yeah.
is to introduce Mr. Jontos, and then before we conclude, I'll make a review of the text amendments per se.
Okay, and I'll ask
But as long as
questions
we're
at that
focused on the site now, I'm going to have Bob Jontos from Land Tech, who is our environmental consultant on this, who's been working with us for 4 or 5 years on this site, and who was very much responsible for helping us get the approvals that we did receive from the DEEP. And he's going to overview for you our environmental plan here relative to this development.
While you're here, Mr. Fallon, one thing I neglected to ask you that I ask all applicants, do you have any objection between now and the time we make a decision for the commission going onto the site?
None whatsoever. The only thing, is the site secure now? Or it is? The only thing we'll need you to do through staff is just kind of let us know so we can make sure that the site is open to you, because right now
Is there a gate locking it?
It is gated. It is gated, but I think we've done that before. I know we did that for the wetlands department, and we'd be happy to do it. So,
Can we just walk in from Rugby Park area? Is there a gate down at that end, do you know?
No.
Wait.
It's fenced off.
It is fenced off, so we'll...
So, and we're not looking for, I'll be there at 2 o'clock on Tuesday. If you just give us
any broad parameters, you know, members of the commission would like to come out sometime probably too, just so we can make sure it's open for you.
Maybe we'll pick a day, and if you could just remind your client, as I know you will, that they should not show up and attempt to talk to us.
No,
because
no.
We can't, as you know.
And you will similarly remind the public.
Well, that's correct, that's correct.
Thank you.
I just don't want them to think they have to be there.
Right.
Mainly just open it up for us.
Okay.
And I'll coordinate with the commissioners, maybe we'll pick a weekend day and a weekday, maybe a Saturday we can have
It
it
appeared
unlocked for us.
yesterday to be unlocked, the large sliding gate. But I didn't go in. Is it all right to go in?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
As long as you don't climb over the fence. Just worried about that.
I wish I could. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Good evening, my name is Robert Jontes, and I'm a professional wetland scientist and certified professional in sedimentation and erosion control with Land Tech Consultants. And briefly, let me run through my charges as they were provided to us by the client, and see if I can orient you to the site and answer some of the questions that have been posed and possibly provide some additional clarification. In terms of our scope of services, we were to delineate inland and tidal wetland soils and water courses limits on the parcel, conduct a functional assessment of the natural resources on and adjacent to site, and prepare recommendations to avoid negative impacts to existing natural resources, and finally prepare plans to mitigate historic impacts and protect water quality from stormwater runoff. In terms of the natural resources on the site, Walter's already told you that you're within the Pine Creek sub-regional basin. We're at the upper limits of the Pine Creek estuary. We have a mixing of both tidal and freshwater flows. Along the southern reaches of the site, you have a large 48-inch culvert which drains down the post road area, comes in through the site, discharges down through a tidal channel and eventually out into the larger marsh. You also have the box culvert, which is on the western limits of the parcel, that discharges as a point discharge at this location. Excuse me. In terms of tidal flows within the parcel, there's already been some discussion of the investigation done by Dr. Boland. And in essence, what he was charged with was to look at the tidal influence at the project site relative to the reported 5.8 one-year flood elevation that is typically applied to this area. His investigation took place in April 2007. He set a series of recorders both at the southern limits of the parcel, at the outlet culverts, and at the Old Dam Road overpass bridge. He measured the tidal fluctuations at the mouth of the river, at the mouth of the Pine Creek estuary as well, and compared those elevations relative to what he observed on top. His conclusions were that the flow within the Pine Creek is choked off by a variety of different structures, thus diminishing the elevation or amplitude of the high tide at the southern limits of the site, or at the edge of the current asphalt. He determined that with an elevation of approximately 3.5 was the high tide line. During his investigation, there was a significant runoff event, some 5 inches in 24 hours that took place, that volume being recorded at Sikorsky Airport. He noted that it had a direct impact on the elevation of the high tide, or the water levels within the upper marsh during the flood tide. Thus, he raised the elevation to 4.0 as the segregating line between what is considered to be inland and what is considered to be coastal in terms of the high tide. That regulatory limit elevation was also adopted by the DEP after reviewing Dr. Boland's investigation. In terms of water chemistry, there's been some discussion of salinities. And we are, in fact, in a situation where we're running from about 0.5 to approximately 18 parts per thousand at various portions of the site. As we get into the tidal marshes, we conducted a series of soil pits within this area, and we found, especially within the pan areas, we had concentrations over 22, which are actually close to what's happening out in Long Island Sound due to evaporation. But within the lower reaches, especially at the point discharges of the culvert, of the box culvert and the 48-inch round culvert pipe, our salinities dropped way down. Due to the elevation of those two structures, the tidal influence actually extends up and into the pipe some distance, so that your influence of tidal flows, your estuary mixes back up into the piping systems that drain from the post road back down.
You're saying the pipe backs up?
Pipe does not back up. The water is mixed. The
Mixed.
freshwater discharges, which are taking stormwater runoff as well as groundwater flows, and I would assume historically piped water courses into that system and discharging at this point.
When you did your water sampling, I know to your north, historically, there were issues when the town acquired a portion of the Fairpreen property. They had some arsenic on the front lawn there, and there may have been trichloroethylene. And then to your northwest, you have the lead that's being picked up in groundwater wells from the Exide property. Have you picked up any of that on this site at all in your samplings?
Our sampling was relegated to non-hazardous materials. That would be more appropriately addressed by the geotechnical people.
Gotcha.
I'm sorry, meaning you didn't test for those?
No, our principal interest was the physical chemistry of the water, salinities, and where in fact we were observing the variations in salinities, which would be used to guide us in terms of our planting plan. Interestingly enough, Dr. Boland's investigation suggests that elevation 3.0 was approximately mean sea level, and that was borne out by the evidence of saline plants, saline-tolerant plants at approximately the same elevation.
Thanks. I have one more question.
This
Could
is
you-
obviously not an aquifer protection area based on its location.
But before you get into the next section, could you just go back to the instructions that, the request of the client? You started rather quickly, I apologize, I didn't catch that.
Sure.
At the very beginning, your charges, yes.
All right, delineate inland and tidal wetlands and water course limits. Now, you understand you have variables in terms of Connecticut inland wetlands, Army Corps inland wetlands, and tidal wetlands. They have different criteria.
Mm-hmm.
The functional assessment of the natural resources on and adjacent to site. Principally, we're looking at the floral habitats as well as the physical environment.
Mm-hmm.
Prepare recommendations to avoid negative impacts to existing natural resources.
Would that be for the build? So to prepare
Yes.
recommendations for the as-built, that would minimize the negative impacts to the site and surrounding areas.
Absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
And finally, prepare plans to mitigate historic impacts and protect water quality from stormwater runoff.
To mitigate historic impacts and protect...
Treat stormwater quality.
Got it.
We want to make sure that we are following as much as possible the standards established by DEEP in terms of the stormwater manual.
Right.
And I'll get to that in just a minute to emphasize that.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Excuse me. For all intent and purposes, the site is devoid of vegetation, as Walter's displays have indicated for you. However, we do have a frag margin along the eastern side of the site, and along the southern portions of the site, we do have some indicators of tidal influence, basically high tide bush. We do have salt pan habitats, which are these darker areas that you see developing south of the parcel. These are areas that have been allowed to concentrate salt due to evaporation and thus become highly saline in terms of the soil and changing the habitat to those plant species which are able to tolerate such conditions. Obviously, the dominant plant species within the entire Pine Creek system is Phragmites, the common reed. In terms of proposed conditions, after we had a chance to review and digest what we had in the way of existing conditions, we saw a number of opportunities. First of all, we felt we could mitigate some of the historical impacts of tidal wetlands. Also, we could provide a low-impact development, best management practices for stormwater based on the current DEP criteria, which provides for a treatment train, which is what Walter had discussed with you before. And that consists simply of a series of treatment devices all connected together, starting with the interior portions of the site, the rain gardens, moving through the porous travelway into the grass-lined swales, and eventually into the bioretention system or bioswale. With respect to the extended physical settling and filtration of suspended solids Each of these will be provided for by the above treatment criteria. In terms of infiltration and runoff, we have the opportunity here to remove nutrients by direct adsorption of these nutrients to the soil particles as well as through microbial activities. In terms of dispersions of runoff, we wanted not to emulate what had gone on previously relative to point discharges, which result in one, highly concentrated freshwater flows into an estuarine environment, which causes stress on the systems, as well as provide for removal of some of these suspended solids. Recently, the Town of Fairfield Engineering Department has just cleaned out the creek that is the recipient of the discharge from the 48-inch culvert because of accumulated sediment. We feel that we can accomplish that with the systems that we're proposing here. Excuse me. We feel that all of these, for all of the above reasons, our system is highly superior to what currently exists. And we also have the opportunity here to introduce a transitional floral environment. And it looks like I'm going to lose some drawings. Excuse me for a moment.
Mr. Johnson, while you're looking at that, you indicated the town had done some cleanouts. Are there, maybe you don't know the answer to this, are there existing easements to the town of Fairfield on this, over this site for them to access the open space property, or maybe Mr. Jobst is rejuvenated and rises again?
I'm so good at answering questions. Let me answer this one. In our discussions with Town Engineering Department, they requested that we do just that, provide an easement so that they can get access to that channel. So we will be providing a, I think it's 15-foot easement off on a northeasterly portion of the site, so they can get in here, and then a little small offshoot on the upland side of this tidal wetland, so they can stay on the upland and get access to this creek this way. So we're going to, I'll be positive. When this gets approved, part of our filings on the land record will be an easement map, and that'll show that easement on there to provide town access to that creek in the future.
Commissioner Jacobson?
I think that Mr. Jobst has to answer this question.
Mr. Jobst?
The part where the encroachment is, the town part, is that is not going to be remediated, correct? Has it been tested, and how is the town going to gain access to that?
That'll be the next segment. That'll be the next presenter. Mr. Carr and Attorney Miller. I don't have all of these.
Okay.
In your packet, you should have a representation that looks like this. This is a typical cross-section of what we anticipate we can restore to the area in terms of different floral habitats. Obviously, you're coming in from the Tidal Marsh on the right-hand side. We have a transition up. Within this particular zone, we expect to be able to see species of groundsel tree as well as high tide bush and other transitional areas. We have the walkway, and then we transition back down into the bioswale, where again we have a well-drained environment moving into what we would anticipate to be a seasonally saturated or maybe permanently saturated soil profile, then transitioning up behind the homes with additional well-drained soils where we'll see different type of shrub species being introduced at that location. On your drawing set, you have a complete list of the type number of plants being proposed. And on the big there's been some questions raised relative to pedestrian access, and what we're proposing to provide for on this system is a walkway that will start at the foot of Thorpe Street, go all the way around the back of the units, and wind up exiting out here to Rugby Park area, where the public can actually traverse the entire area. With respect to interpretive signage, we felt to be appropriate, once we have the systems established, to provide public education into what has happened on the site, what are they looking at, how does the low-impact development stormwater BMPs affect a positive impact on water quality that we don't have right now, and also to show them what kind of habitats exist out there and what things might be of interest to them in terms of the different types of animals that might utilize that area, or just the type of plants that will grow in different environments over a relatively short distance, specifically based on drainage characteristics as well as salinities.
So Mr. Jontos, these are instructional signs you're talking about, in addition to just signs that would let people know they're allowed to walk there?
This is what we contemplated, was just based, you've seen these interpretive signs at the zoo.
Yeah, of course.
Something similar of this nature.
Now, is that part of the agreement that's been worked out, or are they simply suggested? Would
This
this
is
have to be,
suggestions.
well, this is a suggestion. So this would be a suggestion that we might consider as part of the conditions of approval?
Might or might
Okay,
not.
but point is that there's nothing agreed to yet, these are
No.
suggestions. Okay.
The surface
Wagner.
of, I'm sorry?
I could just follow up on his question?
Yep.
So, we're looking at the typical planting.
Mhm.
So the signs that you're talking about would be relative to the walking path and
The
the
edge of the
berm?
walking path.
Right. Would that also be related to what people would be looking at over the estuary?
Absolutely.
It would.
One and the same.
And in that, are you contemplating that the pavement will still be there?
The pavement may still be there, or it may in fact go by way of what all pavement does, is to be replaced by plants in terms of activities. But if you have an interpretive signage where somebody can stand on the stone dust path, which is certainly capable of supporting bicycles or wheelchairs, they can look out over the system and get a sense of where they are relative to the entire system, the watershed itself, which is a concept that a lot of people have difficulty with.
Right.
Mr. Jontos, if you were just to allow the existing pavement that encroaches on town property to crumble up and have plants grow through, you know, it's my understanding that the asphalt's a petroleum-based product. What effect does that have on the environment if you don't remove it but leave it there and let it just get absorbed into the groundwater, into the marsh?
This is a little beyond my expertise.
Is that Attorney Miller?
Yeah,
Or someone
but
else?
in terms of the breakdown of the materials or the binding of the materials, I would anticipate there would be some treatment provided simply by the bacteria that are available there for that purpose. We often associate plants with cleansing, but we discount a major consideration, and that's the microbes that we don't see. And yet these are the ones that are primarily responsible for nutrient attenuation and the impacts of nitrogen on saline systems. In freshwater systems, phosphorus is a limiting nutrient. In saline systems, nitrogen. So it is our intent here to provide for mechanisms where we can go from a well-drained to poorly drained environment to allow for microbial decomposition of those nutrients, driving them off as nitrate and nitrous oxide. So it's not just one thing that you're doing. We also provided for in the report a complete long-term management plan for maintenance of the bioretention system, as well as a full invasive species management plan. With Phragmites directly adjacent to the site, obviously that's a point of consideration.
Yep. Questions about
Commissioner Wagner, then Commissioner.
Thanks. Did you have a chance to see Mr. Stenke's letter?
Yes, I did.
There's one part of this that I was hoping maybe you could comment on. It's the section B, design conflict with side slopes, where he talks about the swale being built upon unstable ground, and that possibly the way that this has been designed will cause uneven grades and interrupt flow patterns, leading to stagnating water, odors, and mosquito breeding. Can you respond to that
Be happy
section?
to. If you'll let me go through my next section, I'll address each of them.
Sure, I just thought we were at the swale.
All right.
But any time, but I'm interested in the response.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You've already heard this evening, I'm sorry.
Commissioner
Yeah, just since you're
Parker.
demonstrating with the profile there, where in the profile would we find the weirs? Are they under the swale itself?
Let me go
or-
to a different drawing for you. This is part of your master sheet. But if you look at these, and this is a typical, a collection of typical drawings. This is one of your wooden walkways over the fixed weir that we spoke of. And with respect to location on the drawings, they show up as the red areas. But that's what it would look like in cross-section. All right? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, Commissioner Jacobs?
Yes, sir.
In the small set, this is what we have.
Yeah.
Nobody can hear.
The plans. The small set does not give the list of plants, as you had said.
I found the plans.
I was looking in the other set.
Yeah, the set you told us to disregard, we can't disregard because the plants are in that one.
So, Mr. Fallon told us to get rid of that one, but we gotta get that one. While we're at that, I'll let you just give testimony on this. The planting that you're gonna do within the swale. In the actual swell, I'm assuming that most of the time that will be a freshwater environment.
It would be my expectation that the salinities would be low enough to allow for freshwater plants to develop in it.
My concern is that when you have a major event, that you'll have saltwater intrusion, and will you have plants that will tolerate the saltwater intrusion that will occur in a major event?
One of the things that we've come to learn in the last 40 years of playing with wetlands is the three most important things you have to understand here is that Mother Nature doesn't read your plans. And to that respect, if you're looking at an elevation of 4, it's not going to be a tabletop 4. There's going to be microtopography within there. Within that microtopography, we're going to see a segregation of plants that are more tolerant of salt and less tolerant of salt. We're also going to find that there are portions of that swale that have higher salt concentrations than other areas, simply by virtue of the fact of the hydraulic flow through the berm. So I would expect a mosaic of plants within there. Where they're going to be, I can't tell you. Once the site is constructed, then we can see where the plants are telling us where they want to be, and we'll adjust the planting plan appropriately for that.
Okay, part of the reason for the concern is, within the next few months, if you go down to the beach area that was flooded, those were all non-salt tolerant areas. Everyone landscaped in non-salt tolerant plants, and the beach area is going to be brown.
Thus the reason for us taking salinity readings out here and waiting to see what nature dictates to us, rather than us trying to convince her that we've got the right answer.
If I could, Commissioner, I'm sorry. Yeah, I respect enormously what you're bringing to this professionally. I mean, my understanding is as a River Lab volunteer parent, but in that experience, it does strike me though that there's going to have to be some sort of larger commitment here. You know what I'm saying? That if you, I mean, what is the long-term commitment by the applicant going forward? I mean, 10 years from now, you know, who knows what has been planted is going to survive. Is this something that is part of a longer term? I mean, how would that work?
Typically, what we would anticipate here within a 5-year monitoring period to monitor what goes on within the system. At that time, it'll tell us, what plants were successful, which ones weren't, which ones should be replanted, where they should be replanted, and that'll act as not only a guide for future managers of this area, but also for other designs taking a similar approach. So it's an educational tool as well as a management tool.
Now, when you describe those words, education management, is this spelled out in the, my apologies for not looking at the document more deeply, but the DEP agreement, is this part of that, or no?
It is not part of the DEP agreement. There was permission and was granted based on what we were proposing to do. But it has always been a typical aspect of this is to monitor the system to make sure you establish what you should be establishing within the area. Will it match entirely with what we got on the planting plan? Probably not.
Right.
We may discard some of those species and add different ones that aren't there.
The evolution's fine, but you're saying that this period of time will allow for that, that you'll be, that the applicant's responsible for it. Okay.
Yes.
Well, because that's, if I could just follow up on that, because you're saying in the typical application, it's the owner of the property, the homeowner would have to go back and look at it, but we have a shared environment here. So is there, you mentioned that the 5 or 10 year study will inform the manager of the, is there going to be a manager of this,
who is the we?
Bike path?
The plan is that this will be a condominium development, so that there certainly will be, you know, a condominium board, there likely will be a property manager of the condominium association.
Right.
And so there certainly will be that kind of ongoing management of the property.
But it's one thing to say that, you know, it won't become, is there a proposal that part of that board will be a management of this area to keep it in the manner in which it is being proposed to be built in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, in perpetuity, because this is now a public bike path, et cetera?
I understand. I mean, the answer to that would be we could certainly place such a requirement in the condominium documents.
Right, because somebody's got to pay for that, right? I mean, ultimately, it's going to cost somebody money to have somebody manage that.
Of course, it's an amenity for the association as well, so you would think it's money that residents would want to spend, because this is going to be an area that I would think the residents are going to want to keep maintained in a positive way.
Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the residents decide and their co-op board that they want to trim some costs and that they don't want to replant this area, you know, someday in the future. Is that a possibility in the hypothetical?
That kind of neglect?
Yes.
I can't tell you it's a possibility or it's not. I mean, I suppose human nature 20 years from now, who knows?
Well, is it a requirement? Is it a requirement of, or is it being proposed by the applicant that it would be required of the co-op board?
We have no objection to that. I mean, if you can write that in as a condition, then you have zoning enforcement with regard to that. It's our intention with the time and effort and money, if you will, that's been spent to come up with this design, and the fact that it is an important amenity. So I think the answer to that would be yes. I think if you can craft, and I think you can, a condition of approval that would impose that obligation for continued maintenance on the association, then that would be something that would have to be disclosed in the condo documents, could be made part of the condo, you know.
The deed, the restrictive deed.
People would know about it, and you'd have a linchpin of
Right.
zoning enforcement.
Because at some point, the applicant here is no longer going to own.
No, we'll be gone. You're right.
Right.
So I think the answer, I think your questions and are well placed, and I think the way to do that is to talk in terms of a condition of approval, among what I think will be numerous conditions of approval, that would impose that obligation on the association as a matter of the zoning approval.
Very good, thank you.
Commissioner Barron?
Yeah, Mr. Chantos?
Yes, sir.
Just take you through how the typical planning scheme gets into the transition plan. Could you just give me a sense, like the width of all this, the typical width? I know it varies, but like how wide is this transition zone?
You're looking at a zone that's approximately 25 feet wide.
25 feet wide.
Variable. Some places a little
Variable.
wider, some places a little narrower.
Yep.
But that's typically what we're looking at.
So it's about 25 feet wide, and about 5 feet of it is the walking path?
That's on the southern edge.
On the southern edge, okay. Just trying to visualize what this
Yep.
is going to look like. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I know you've been told before about some impervious areas, and I just want to drive home a couple of points. Right now, the site's 95% covered by impervious. Post-development, we're looking at impervious conditions to reduce to approximately 2.4 acres, a 61% reduction. Now, this is a critical consideration in terms of low-impact development design criteria. The biofiltration system constructed along the southern and eastern perimeter of the site is about 9/10 of an acre in size. And this is going to take that first flush of runoff coming from the site, detain it, allow it to infiltrate, allow physical settling, as well as chemical attenuation and biological attenuation. In terms of releasing the controlled volume of water and dispersing it along the system, we've called for a series of 10-foot long crushed stone drains underneath the system, spaced about every 100 feet apart, to provide for flow. Now, we're anticipating infiltration, lateral movement as well, both through the berm and through the soils constructed of the berm. We're also expecting movement through the existing soils out there. This is predicated upon the observation of the groundwater gradient coming from the interior of the site, moving southerly and also moving in an easterly fashion. In terms of drainage, we're looking for this entire system to drain within 72 hours. That was the design criteria. And this, of course, is important because we don't want to contribute to an extended period of ponding. I know there was some concern raised in Mr. Stanky's letter about the potential here for mosquito breeding areas. They typically take 5 to 7 days to incubate, and we're going to lose our water within 72 hours, if not sooner. Mr. Stanky also was concerned about the gravel drains blinding into the sidewalls of the areas of the town-owned property to the south. Those being in these areas. It's our expectation, based on our observations out here, that there is water movement, groundwater movement, moving down through the site and discharging at the lower lip of that area. Excuse me.
So the area you're pointing at now is the town of Fairfield property on which there is pavement?
That's correct, that's this area here.
And can you repeat what you just said about that water flow?
It is our expectation that groundwater flows are moving under that system right now, underneath that pavement, and moving out into the marsh.
And that ground underneath the pavement right now is contaminated, correct?
I'll let the geotech speak to that.
Is it your understanding that it is or not?
My understanding is that it is urban fill, which is what my soil sample showed me it was.
What do you mean by urban fill?
It's been filled with soil, been filled with other materials, so it contains substances that would typically be found in an urbanized environment.
Meaning trash?
No, I didn't find any trash in my soil sample. I found pieces of stone, pieces of brick, but I didn't find any trash.
Okay, and so, based upon what you just said, then the runoff from the site, as built, will go through the berm. And
that's one direction.
One direction?
Also down.
Down?
And water is like electricity, flows in the path of least resistance. The bottom of the swale is flat, elevation 4.0, plus or minus. It's also going to move towards areas where there's water moving through the other drains underneath the system. So we're taking advantage of all the available paths for water to drain slowly out of the system and thus slowly release it back into the estuary rather than one big surcharge.
Okay, and it's going to come underneath that pavement on the town of Fairfield property and back into the estuary?
Exactly, as well as moving easterly and vertically down.
Okay.
We didn't. Somebody else had a question?
I was going to ask, do you have results of your soil samples that we can see?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, they're in the soils reports that the tidal wetlands investigation that we did.
Yeah,
we'll get them to the staff heads. I don't think we have this.
Yeah. The soil sampling that we did in terms of tidal wetland delineations are just reported in terms of what we found in terms of, aquifer soil, the redoxomorphic features and the texture of the soil. But we're welcome to provide those to you as well.
Mr. Jontes, are you the individual who's going to address the walkway and the surface
Yes,
construction of that? Could you, in your plans, you just talk about a stone top layer.
Yep.
What size stones, will someone be able to ride a bicycle should they want to pedal up from the park?
I believe I stated earlier on that we were using a stone dust.
Stone dust.
2-inch of compacted
You
stone
can run
dust.
on it too, yeah.
You can run, walk, ride a bicycle, push a wheelbarrow over it, whatever you want. Does that answer your question?
That was the question. Thank you.
Excuse me. There was also some concern that we were going to intercept groundwater in Mr. Stanky's letter in terms of the depth of the swale. We found no groundwater elevations over here based on the geotechnical borings that were done. In the far northeastern corner, there was water observed between 2.5 and 3 feet below the surface, but our cuts in that area are only from 12 to 18 inches, so the groundwater should still be below the bottom of the swale based on our observations.
How deep are you going with the foundations here? Are you going to be in groundwater for these units, or are they sitting on top of the ground?
They're going to be on piers, I believe.
On piers?
Mm-hmm. Again, Mr. Horvath would probably be more appropriate to speak to that than I.
Thank you.
There was also concern about the velocity, and Mr. Jobs also indicated that we're talking velocities of 1 to 2 feet per second, which is non-erosive. Not until you get up above 5 feet per second do you find potential for soil erosion. In addition to the stormwater filtration and nutrient uptake that transitional floral plantings provide, we're also providing soil stability On our cross-sections, which are also part of the larger set of plans that I guess you don't want to discount in terms of land text drawings, you can see that we are matching the grades. We used Mr. Job's grading plan to develop the grading for our bioswale, so they should be very close to being identical. In terms of the last comment about 2-to-1 slopes in Mr. Stanky's letter, I think the confusion may result from the drawing on this particular sheet, which is E4 of 5. We show 2-on-1 on the cross sections, and that obviously, these are for general informational purposes. They are typical details. They state right on the plan, not for construction. This is for informational purposes only. We don't want to go more than 2-on-1. It's too difficult to stabilize. You have to get into additional measures to provide stable slopes when you get that, and they're hard to maintain in the long term.
This is, that comment was directly in relationship to the Section B.
Yeah, our cross-sections are based on Walter Job's grading plans, which were revised to reflect the recommendations from the geotechnical engineers.
Okay,
So we have our plans. I think the confusion comes, Mr. Stanky's looking at these typical sections and seeing 2-on-1, when in reality, the cross-sections that we provided show that we're at 3-on-1 and 4-on-1 respectively.
And, okay, so where are the actual 3-on-1 and 4-on-1?
This is sheet E5.
E5, I don't
Yep.
We don't have that.
We don't have that.
We don't
It
have.
should be part of the larger set that you were told,
We don't.
that you previously
Not there.
received.
Oh, that we previously received?
Yeah, it was in the office
Yeah.
previously.
Yes, but now we have to...
E5 is in the one that we're supposed to disregard. I wonder if anybody wants it.
Now, was this E5 in the materials that Mr. Stanky had to review?
You should have had, yes.
So you think he just made a mistake?
I think he may have been confused by the typical drawing showing the 2-on-1, when in reality, these are the cross-sections taken from the contours.
Yeah, I mean, because clearly he says that on page 11, the geotechnical report specifically rejects the applicant's engineering design for grading of the biofiltration swale cut slopes at a ratio of 2 horizontal to 1 vertical and requires a maximum slope of 4-to-1, right?
I think you'll find if you scale these, you'll see.
And I just trying to be clear about it because it's a pretty, I think, significant statement that he makes in this letter. So it's your position, the applicant's position, and in the plans, in fact, it is at 4-to-1.
3-to-1 and 4-to-1.
3-to-1 and 4-to-1, depending on different places in the
Precisely.
swale.
And in areas where we're not in the soils that Walter identified as being of susceptible to settling.
Right.
We're 2-on-1, and where we're in fill, we're 2-on-1.
Okay, so that was the other aspect of this paragraph, right, is the unstable soil.
Yep.
So, so the response basically is twofold. Number one, he made a mistake. There are actually 3-to-1 and 4-to-1 across the berm, and in those areas where there is unstable soil, then you've accommodated for that and you're going 2-to-1.
No,
No,
just the reverse.
just the reverse, okay?
Where we
Right,
have the
right.
unstable soils, we're following the geotech's recommendation to go 3-on-1 in the southern, 4-on-1 in the
You're
north.
right. I got it backwards, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right? And they do vary throughout the entire section because of the way the ground contours are and the way it's been graded. So, and if somebody finds it to the fact that it needs to be tweaked, we can tweak it. I mean, I think you'll find in all instances that we are consistent with what Walter has shown. We've tried to provide a base map that was consistently used throughout the project so that we wouldn't make mistakes.
To follow up on Commissioner Wagner's dissection of this letter in this area,
going down on B. This was kind of scary, and maybe I could ask you to respond to it, or Mr. Jobs. Further, the applicant only proposes to surcharge its own filled property to accelerate settlement to a stabilized condition prior to development, with no intention of surcharging the adjacent filled town property, which will continue to slowly subside into the underlying peat and muck in the future. This differential settlement of the adjacent town property may contribute to mud waves and disruption of the excavated biofiltration swale, causing uneven grades and interrupted flow patterns, and then what Commissioner Wagner was talking about before, leading to stagnating water, odors, etc. Is that the case? Mr. LaFosse will answer that? Okay.
Mr. LaFosse, who is the geotech
Great.
consultant, will address that.
I have nothing more for the commission, if you have more
But one
questions.
more question for you, actually, real quick. In your experience where these kinds of transitional areas, et cetera, are created, this is a complex man-made system, and I guess my question is how important is it for that complex man-made system that you're introducing to work and the life, kind of the lifetime of these systems, and I'm asking you, how much work is going to have to go into maintaining what man has built here, not to do long-term damage to or significantly impact, let's say, the surrounding environment. What's involved here? If it fails, yeah, exactly. What happens?
I think it's important to recognize something that Mr. Job said earlier, that 90% of the precipitation events are less than 1 inch in rainfall. Every now and then we get a significant event. In those instances, we will see water pond within the system and rise up. But as the water rises and falls, it also drains away. And the one thing that we have to consider that is a critical component of not only the swale, but also the rain gardens, are the root structures. Root structures are constantly creating channels. As the roots die off, new channels, new infiltration channels are created as more roots develop. So it's a self-sustaining system from that aspect. And in terms of the overall impact of accumulated sediment, will sometime in the future, will somebody have to go in there and remove some of this accumulated sediment? It may be, but how long is it going to be? I really can't say. But the thing to consider here is, this is not the typical stormwater management system where you're putting in catch basins with a direct piping to a discharge, which is what we're seeing on the town property. You're providing for attenuation within the rain gardens, infiltration, and then movement through the rest of the system for treatment as well as dispersal. So it's just not one component, it's the whole system working together. We're finding that these rain gardens are really quite self-sustaining, both in terms of vegetation, once they become established and managed properly for a couple of years, and they work just fine, all by themselves.
Yeah, I hope that's the case. The reason I bring this up is, I spent a lot of time in Lake Mohegan, and, there's a terrific example. A lot of people don't realize, what the history there was, quarry, et cetera, and we went through a really savage blizzard here, and you really get a sense of how nature, because there's a tremendous amount of work by the efforts of the town to really maintain that property. Trucks are in and out of there. The guys are terrific. The men and women who work there are great. But nature wrought havoc in there. I mean, big trees gone. Things, I've been walking there for 8-9 years, and this year was very different. You know what I'm saying? So even the best managed that we had in town, the best managed complex efforts to kind of terraform can be swept away by nature. By nature's wrath. You would agree with that?
I can't disagree with you. You're absolutely right.
Because one of the things we have to consider as we decide to act in our legislative capacity is, are we making choices that don't just matter about how things are today or 5 years from now, but who's going to live with this 30, 40, 50 years from now?
The other aspect of that is, who can predict when the next event's going to come? Is it going to be Is the 100-year storm going to be twice this year, or is it going to be 60 years from now? I can't say.
Well, I
Commissioner-
don't know about the current blizzard, but if the most recent blizzard we had came as rain, how would that have affected the system?
I think we'd all be walking around in water.
Yeah.
Commissioner Wagner.
Thanks. So, forgive my ignorance with this question, but, and not to imply that you haven't, but have you built one of these before?
One of these systems?
Yeah.
We've built similar systems, yes.
And what, can you share with us some of that experience? When did you build them? How long ago were they? How have they been managed? Are they working? Where are they?
Well, you've got similar systems at the Fairfield Metro Station. You've got a series of infiltrators that are directly adjacent to the eastern portion of the created wetland. You have a wetland system that daylights a formerly pipe stream, goes into a freshwater system with a series of islands and shallow areas and a transitional margin.
At Metro Center, you're talking about?
Metro Center.
Now, that was built very recently.
That's correct.
Okay.
That transitions into an estuarine basin that transitions into a tidal basin. That tidal basin periodically floods the estuarine basin, creating estuarine conditions within there. Eventually, once they put the structures on site, you have a series of biofilters up on top by the stone wall that will receive runoff from the buildings that flow subsurface into a double row of filtration bays. If you go out there, you'll see that in the bottom of one of the bays you have water, and the other you do not. But natural colony, meaning that the groundwater elevations are a little bit different from point A to point B, but nevertheless, a wetland condition has developed in the bottom of the system. And that water moves through the soils into the freshwater wetland system and the estuarine system.
So you're saying the system is working?
Oh yeah. It's not receiving the volume of flows that it will once all the structures are up. But we've been able to create the system. And along the shoreline, we haven't planted anything. DEP wanted us to allow for natural colonization. They felt that the adjacent Spartina alterniflora patches along the creek would provide the necessary source materials. So we're monitoring that for 3 years, and then after that 3-year period, we'll make suggestions that if it's not developing as we anticipate, that we'll add plugs to it.
Right.
The other thing to observe
What
out
is
there,
the 3-year check back? Was that a requirement of the DEP?
it was an arbitrary number. When we started first building wetlands, it was a 3-year monitoring period. And of course, 3 years, we really don't have enough information. We're going to go to 5. And 5 years became the paradigm. After 3 years, you know what's going to happen with the system. Are you having Phragmites colonizing the area? Is it out-competing the Spartina? What's happening with the system? You see trends, because you're checking it in the fall and in the spring. And you're evaluating what's happening, and you're providing those reports to the regulatory agencies.
When you say you mean your organization?
Yes, our firm's doing it. So it's a learning experience. This goes back to the question of how often do you have to maintain it? As often as you need to. Well, how long is it? I don't know. Look at the large particle separators. They were supposed to have to be treated for quite some time, but depending upon their location and the area draining to them and how that area was managed, they had to be cleaned out more often. So it's a learning experience, and that's the only way we're going to learn how to effectively manage the environment around us, especially when we're going from an area that's totally paved to something that is a 61% reduction in impervious surfaces, and we're restoring those transitional zones that existed there years ago, but we're trying to do it in a way that we're getting multiple functions out of it. Aesthetics, public access, stormwater management, as well as habitat. So it's a learning experience for all of us. I don't have all the answers, and every day I learn something else I didn't know.
So aside from Metro Center,
that's the best example I can give you right now.
Okay.
Go take a look at that.
Right, and I appreciate that very much. I'm trying to get an understanding of whether something similar has been built, say, 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago? And if there's any experience around that?
I can give you a list of wetlands that we've built. I can also give you a list of infiltration systems. The first one that comes to mind, and I will shut up after this, is up in Weston on Pheasant Hill. There is a infiltration basin that was created to take all of the stormwater from a subdivision and infiltrate it back into the ground. Take it right up there and take a look at it.
Well, that's a typical infiltration system.
Yep.
Right, I mean, we see those all the time. Those are being built all the time. I'm talking about this creation of this bio-berm that is designed to intercede the runoff of the property, filter it, and let it naturally, go into the estuary.
That's Fairfield Metro Center.
And I appreciate that. We've talked about that. Is there anything else similar on which we have experience going more than 3 years?
No, because it hasn't really been utilized longer than that.
Okay, last question, I promise. Last question, I promise, on this line. So what happens if this fails? For whatever reason, let's say it's not managed, let's say it is managed, but it just is, something happens. It doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. What happens in this area to this site?
What doesn't work?
I don't know. I guess that's the same point to your point, but it's part of the whole stormwater management system. So if it fails, the site might flood?
It fails to what?
If the bio-berm fails, the site, in general, the site might flood?
No.
No, I think,
No.
can I just...
I'm trying to understand some...
If anything, let's just...
Give me an example of a
impacts the
problem that
environment.
might be foreseeable.
For whatever reason, the berm breaches. Why that would happen, I have no idea. But if that were a breach, then you get back and repair it, put it back together again, and recompact it, and build the filters again, as we proposed.
I think it gets back, Commissioner, if I can interrupt you, the question and the comment, the thoughtful comment I thought you made before, and that is on a slightly different angle, is, but how do we keep some continuing jurisdiction here, if you will, relative to these things which we think are innovative and positive, but we want to make sure they just don't go to hell in a handbasket over 5 years. And so my answer would be the same as my answer to the last question, which is I think you can write conditions of approval imposing upon the condo association certain responsibilities to manage and to monitor these facilities. They might, and that would include the requirement that, for example, that Mr. Jontos would have to come back at 3 years, 5-year interval, or whatever, and that would just be disclosed in the condo documents, would be enforceable as a condition of zoning approval, and if anybody had concerns about that, then they wouldn't buy into the condo.
Mr. Jontos, just so we're clear, I mean, the concern I was trying to raise, the concern I was trying to raise is really, it's less to do with flooding, it's more to do with potentially, what will happen to the surrounding environment. And what you're saying is that essentially this is the best theoretical science we can offer. You guys have gone out there, since 2007, you've looked at these different kinds of things. At the end of the day, it's theory. You're not going to be able to point to 6 or 7 or 10 different examples along the waterfront where this occurred already and this has been working. And at the end of the day, there's a certain amount of uncertainty. As you said, I don't know. Is that a fair assessment? This is the best technical assessment, but at the end of the day, there is that I don't know. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say, but I think it's fair to say also that this is not something that has been entered into lightly.
No.
And we have looked at all the experience of others. We've looked at the design manuals. We've talked to people at the DEP Stormwater Group. They are very excited about this concept. And they actually want to use it as a demonstration site of what can be done in retrofitting an urban environment with a system that accomplishes all the goals we've established for ourselves here.
See, here's this one. I apologize, Mr. Fallon. I'll gladly let you follow. I just want to ask this one thing. But that's my concern a little bit, is that I'm worried about how I can tell you, trying to write a condition of approval for our chairman, I'm a River Lab dad. So how will I, Mr. Fallon, write, or how will any of us here, except perhaps for Mr. Jacobs, who knows a lot more about this than me, but how will we effectively write conditions of approval that can really look out into the future to ensure that, should there be problems with this theoretical approach, there isn't a long-term damage to the larger ecosystem. That is a concern for me.
Before the
You know,
hearing
sure.
is closed,
Okay.
which I think we safely can say will not be tonight.
Forgive our diligence.
Working with, no, and I commend your diligence, working with Mr. Jontos, we will submit, with your permission, some draft condition of approval language on those points, written not by me, but by him, as if he were consulting on behalf of the commission, how you would do this. The point I was going to make, because I think it's assumed in the conversation, this was not the best technical solution, it wasn't the cheapest solution by any means. It is the best environmental solution. We've worked very hard with the DEP going on 5 years now, and what Bob said is true. They're excited about this. So, yes, we're blazing a trail here, but it's a trail very much worth blazing because it is by far the most beneficial way to approach the regeneration of this site. Your points are well taken. We'll offer some potential language from Bob's perspective for your considerations that would appropriately define the ongoing obligations of the permittee, who would then be the association, with regard to the management, maintenance, and care of this.
Because at the end of the day, what you don't want is kind of like a sticky, gooey pool, sticky, gooey pool back right behind these neighbors' houses just around the corner. You know, that probably doesn't really improve things.
So we'll work on that, but that would be the approach.
Thank you very much.
At this point, we'll take a 3-minute recess, and during the recess, Mr. Fallon, we'll discuss with staff the scheduling issue that is
Yeah,
going to come
which
up here in a
the
second.
plot thickens, so I need to talk to you about that because of Mr. Galante.
Well, maybe you can talk to your folks too. We're back in session. We've had some discussions with the applicant and his experts during the break. So everyone knows, originally we had scheduled for next Tuesday one of our planning meetings. We've been engaged in a planning process, as many of you know, regarding the subdivision and zoning regulations. It's a continuing process going on over a year now. We've made some changes. Instead of doing the planning meeting on the 2nd, we will continue this hearing on the 2nd, which is next Tuesday. The planning meeting will be on hold. Keep on your schedules the meeting on the 9th the following week. We'll determine next week whether the 9th becomes a planning meeting or a regular business meeting. Keep the 8th open. That's still a tentative date we talked about for a potential planning meeting. And keep the 23rd and the 30th open as well. The 16th is the school break week. We'll probably give you that one off. I think a number of people won't be around, so we'll probably take that one off since we've been meeting, I think, 5 weeks in a row now on these on planning. So again, this application will be continued to the 2nd of April here. And then we have a meeting on the 9th, the 23rd, and keep the 30th opened as well. For not necessarily this, but for other business we have in the commission.
You'll notice Mark Barnhart for the...
Yeah, and there was a request made that we invite Mr. Barnhart to our next planning meeting. Thank you.
I will tell him
This hearing, does 7 work for you folks? 7:30? 7:30. We'll do 7:30 on the 2nd. 7:30 on the 2nd, because we have some commissioners coming in from out of state. It's tough getting here for 7.
Okay.
Thank you. Attorney Fallon.
I do thank the commission, I think on behalf of a lot of people, for your diligence and your time. It's a lot of time. I think it's a good transition. There's a point I just want to make, and I think this is a good transition as we finished up the questions from Mr. Jontos, and now I want to, in a moment, introduce my colleague Barbara Miller and Tim Carr. But you know, I have to get this somewhat off my chest, and it's a matter of process. I've been doing this 35 years, 37 years. There's a process. The process involves, if there's jurisdiction, you go to the Inland Wetlands Agency and you adjudicate. There's, in this case, a very real process with the town engineering department, charged with a lot of things relative to aspects of the matter. I want to answer, and we have and we will, and you'll hear as part of Barbara and Tim's presentation, addressing all the issues that are raised in Mr. Stanky's letter. But I would, because I want anything that's raised before this commission, it's always my habit, from wherever it comes, or however it's appropriate the source, I'm going to address. But I do want to point out, if you look at the minutes
of the Conservation Commission meeting. This is the same body that, acting as a wetlands agency, unanimously approved this after public hearings. The motion that was made on February 21st, 2013, Sam Boyarsky moved and Letita Ferguson seconded to send comments to the Town Plan and Zoning Commission that the Conservation Commission opposes this project, and they should oppose this project until such time that the developer proposes a remediation plan for the town-owned property, and that plan has been accepted by the Town Commission. That's going to be addressed presently. Fully understand that. They wore their inland wetlands hats. They looked at all the issues that would relate to drainage, site engineering, what have you. But then when they put on their conservation hat on February 21st, they had a very specific concern, and that's the failure to remediate the town property. That was on February 21st. On March 25th, the applicant and you are favored with the epistle that we received. And I just want to point out, with all due respect to Mr. Stanky, I think we're on a bit of a slippery slope here, and this commission should be aware of that. Because does this mean every time I go to inland wetlands and have a full public hearing adjudication and get a unanimous approval in inland wetlands permit, and if the Conservation Commission should have a specific conservation concern that by motion they want articulated to you, should send comments, that's going to open it up to a letter of the type that we've got, and we're going to take time and respond your time, our time. All these points that I would suggest to you are not within the purview of the motion and the concern raised by the Conservation Commission. I don't know if the Conservation Commission has seen this letter of March 25, and I guess I don't really care, because we're going to address it. But I would suggest to you that a lot of what's subsumed in Tom's letter are matters that were certainly before the Wetlands Agency when they approved this application unanimously, certainly within the jurisdiction of the engineering department, and certainly within the purview of this commission, and that's why we're addressing them. But I just wanted to say that, because I think it's an interesting precedent.
Commissioner Wagner has a question.
Is it your objection that the letter is outside the scope of the motion that was made at Conservation?
Yes.
So if...
But we're going to address everything that's in it. And I'm not defensive about the letter in terms of its contents or our response. I just think as a matter of process, it's unique in my experience.
I mean, we're not going to engage in a debate. I think there's certainly differing opinions as to whether, in fact, the Director of Conservation for the town has the right or the role or the responsibility of that office to comment on applications that are before.
We're going to respond
to it. Speaking on behalf of a commission or a board, or as the Director of Conservation.
Just to the extent that I wanted to point out for the record that the request that's being acted under was a duly made motion by the Conservation Commission. And I think the letter is certainly broader than the motion, although, again, there's no defensiveness in terms of addressing the questions raised.
From a procedural standpoint, is it your view that the Town Conservation Commission does not have the ability to come to the public hearing before the TPC?
Oh, no, absolutely not.
Because we get letters all the time from
Right, no,
all kinds of interested parties.
The point I was making was simply the point that I made, and that is the Conservation Commission's articulated concern was more focused, and we're going to address it momentarily, than a lot of the comments that were made in the letter, which we will and have addressed as well.
Okay, so just to be clear, it's not that they sent a letter, it's just that you view the letter as being beyond the scope of the motion that was passed at the meeting.
Correct.
Okay.
And correct. That's the simple of it. So, let me at this point introduce my colleague, Barbara Miller from Brody Wilkinson. Barbara is a very well regarded throughout the state environmental lawyer. She has served on the executive committee of the environmental law section of the Connecticut Bar Association. She is an environmental professional, member of the Environmental Professionals Organization of Connecticut, and her practice specializes in the area of representing business, private, government entities with regard to matters of environmental compliance. And she will also introduce, as part of her presentation, our environmental consultant, Timothy Carr of Geodesign. Tim is obviously a licensed environmental professional in the state of Connecticut and has been working on this property and this project diligently for the better part of the last 6 or 7 years. And together they will discuss with you our remediation plan and the phasing of that plan in terms of the construction that's before you tonight for approval.
Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Barbara Miller from the firm of Brody Wilkinson. We work with the applicant as its environmental counsel and also as its corporate counsel. I'd like to try briefly to address some of the issues that have been raised by conservation and others with respect to the fill that was historically placed on the town property south of the boundary of the applicant's property. Looking historically through aerial maps, it appears that the fill was placed there probably in the area of 1959, 1960. Nobody knows who put the fill there. Subsequently, the operator of the property at that time, which was the lumber yard, extended the pavement and put up the fencing. As far as I know, the town took no action against this individual. Nothing was done about it. In approximately 1994, the applicant purchased this property from bankruptcy court. And it was one of those bid and buy situations. You had to move quickly, so no one had the luxury of time to perform a survey of the property. And it was, quite frankly, unclear to the owner applicant where between the fence that was on the property and the buildings the property line lay exactly. The property was leased to an equipment leasing company for many years, first to Mr. McClinch's company, McClinch Equipment, and subsequently to the national company United Rentals. Yes?
You know what year that was rented, that rental started between McClinch and United Rentals?
Mr. McClinch's company rented it, I'm going to say, for approximately 6, 7 years before the sale to United Rentals.
September 98.
Yeah.
From 98?
Yeah, so it was actually a short period of time.
From what year to what year was it rented?
I think it was about 94 to 98 was McClinch Equipment.
Okay.
And then United Rentals bought the stock of McClinch Equipment. So it was basically a continuation of the same company. It was just owned by a larger
When
company.
did United Rentals close, do you know? Or left that site?
When or why?
When?
I'd say maybe 2 years ago.
I'm sorry, Attorney Miller. When you began, maybe I misunderstood. We mentioned that there's this fill put in place between 48 to 60. It was the Fairfield Lumber Company and Supply Company that acquired the property and filled the marsh and enlarged this upland work area and in 5960 crossed the town boundary line and filled it with 1 acre of town property with a swath of about 50 to 100 feet wide, 600 feet long to its southern border. So it was this lumber company.
I don't know that.
You don't know that, but
I
this
don't
is
know.
this is what's posited by the conservation
That's correct.
director.
I don't know.
You don't know that, but that's what the town
I
is
don't know.
saying.
That's what Mr. Stanky is saying.
Right.
And I don't know if he's right or wrong. I
Oh, I
don't know who put the fill there.
You don't know. Okay.
It was not.
So you're not
the
definitively
applicant.
saying no one knows. You don't know. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, I wasn't sure. I'm sorry.
I haven't seen any empirical proof as to who put that fill
Okay.
there.
Well, it was paved by the lumber company, right?
Correct.
And the lumber company put the fence up around the...
Correct.
Right? And then they continued to use the property. So it would make...
I don't know that either, but
Oh,
I
all
could
right,
assume.
okay. I mean, it would make intuitive sense that it was the lumber company that put the fill there in order to pave it and put the fence up.
It's certainly possible.
I see.
All I said is, I don't know, and I haven't seen any proof positive as to who put it there. All I know is it wasn't the applicant.
You say no proof positive, so you didn't research the records or anything prior to during that period of time or anything like that, you just...
Just looked at aerial maps.
Just looked at aerial maps.
It can tell you when it went there, but it can't tell you who did it.
Commissioner Lessie.
By your recollection here, for 17 years, you had your applicant had a crane company and a heavy equipment company on the premises, maintaining construction equipment, washing construction equipment, cleaning it, fueling it, oiling it, greasing it. And according to the testimony from one of the gentlemen before, you've had 100% runoff on there. And so for the last 17 years, basically the marshland has been contaminated from the construction equipment from the tenant on the property site without any oil separators in the ground or catch basins or anything else being used while these companies were maintaining their construction equipment.
I would say that's untrue. In fact,
How's that?
because there was an oil-water separator, because there were buildings which were covered, where construction, maintenance, and washing were conducted. All that was done on this fill piece of property was intermittent parking of vehicles and equipment.
Yeah, but when I asked before...
And what I'm saying is...
No, I'm not talking about the town property. I'm talking about the property itself. When I asked before about were there any catch basins, were there any storm sewers, were there anything in the ground to catch the water, they said no, it was 100% runoff on the property.
There's a separator on the property,
Where?
I'm sure of it.
Where?
No, it's still there. Yeah, it's still there. It's the infrastructure from it is gone, but there is an oil-water separator on the property. Equipment maintenance was done within covered properties. All cleaning materials and any solvents were kept in covered areas.
Well, I mean...
Let me just finish. Mr. Carr was hired by Mr. McClinch to inspect the operations periodically, to write environmental reports to make sure that all efforts were conducted in compliance with environmental law. I'd be happy to get you those reports. So it is not a true statement that the operations there were contaminating the marsh. That's an untrue statement.
Well, I heard before that we had 100% runoff on the property.
Stormwater runoff. That doesn't mean that the operations were not conducted in such a manner that you didn't have solvents, oil, and cleaning fluids going into the marsh. There's a big difference between having something that looks like a parking lot.
Well, I don't understand how we can maintain construction equipment on a slope against a marsh and not have any runoff of any contaminants, of any kind going into the marshland. I don't understand how that's possible.
Is it any different than a parking lot? I don't know, but there was an oil-water
It's a lot different than a parking lot.
But what I'm saying is that the maintenance of the equipment was conducted in such a manner that there were not releases onto the paved area and into the marsh.
So we know all the equipment was power washed and cleaned on top of the oil separator.
Yes.
And do we have reports as to when the oil separator was pumped every time or cleaned out every time?
It was a zero discharge. Well, you can't talk from back there. It's not coming on the record.
Also, while he's coming up, Commissioner, there is, as part of your record, I think that's also on CD, Mr. Carr's environmental report. The areas, if we're focusing on our site now, not the town site, which is what your questions are, the areas of contamination are all delineated. So there's no question that we know the site, the environmental characteristics of the applicant's site. That's been submitted.
So is it also safe to say that depending on where the fence was, that none of the construction equipment has ever been on the Fairfield town property?
That's not what I said.
No, I'm asking that.
I said that there was equipment storage intermittently on that strip of property. There was equipment parked there. It was not maintained there, washed there.
Okay.
There was no material stored
Okay,
there.
where was United Rentals cleaning the property?
They're right here in this picture,
Okay.
in this corner, Ernie Pearson.
Okay.
Who are you, Mr. Pearson?
I'm an officer of 185 Thorpe Street.
Thank you.
In this corner of this building, there is a wash bay.
How big is it?
I don't know the dimensions.
How high is the ceiling?
I don't know.
Well, it's important. I mean, we're
Well, we
putting
can
a
get you the
50,000-pound excavator inside that building.
We can get you the measurements.
The building's still there, Commissioner. When you go out on the property,
You can go look at it.
Without being facetious, you can measure.
I'd like to know.
The building hasn't been
Yeah,
developed.
okay.
We put in a zero discharge wash plant in the facility, which was approved and a permit issued by the state DEP. At the time we put it in, we were one of only 2 companies in the state of Connecticut to do a zero discharge system. They were absolutely thrilled that we were being proactive and we were dealing with the cleaning of the equipment.
What year was that put in?
Around 1995, I don't know the exact year.
Mr. Pearson, just for the record, you say we, what, 185...
McClinch Equipment.
No, let me ask the question so we have a clean record.
Right.
185 Thorpe Street is the property owner. Is
Right.
185 Thorpe Street also the principal of what was McClinch Equipment or United Rentals or one of those? If you could just fill us in on...
There is a affiliated relationship, not wholly owned in the same manner.
Did you have firsthand knowledge of the business affairs of McClinch since you're testifying about this
Yes,
water
I did.
separator? Were you a principal of McClinch, that entity, or had day-to-day involvement with that
Yes, I
operation?
What do you mean by affiliated?
Common ownership,
Okay.
but not in the same, not with the same percentage ownerships.
So the same people own the 2 companies,
Not-
but in different ratios?
Yes.
Okay. May I, while he's here?
Sure. So this is to Mr. Pearson.
The equipment that was parked from time to time on the town property, was it parked on that area from time to time because you knew, or the company at the time knew that it was town property and it
No.
was being used that way sort of differently than other parts of the property?
We didn't know it was town property until a survey was done in connection with developing the property.
When did you first learn that?
I
I'd
would say
about
around,
6 or 7 years
yeah,
ago
about
the
6 years
survey
ago.
was done. And at that time, when there was a realization that the fence wasn't the property line, United Rentals, which was the then
Mm-hmm.
tenant, was put on notice that it was not part of the lease property,
We
that
didn't
it was
do
town
any of the
property.
work that Mr. Lisi was concerned about anywhere other than in those areas that were designated by the DEP, so that's
Right,
why.
yeah. I'm not talking about that right now. But, so, the whole time that you owned the property, from the time you purchased it from the bankruptcy court, you never had to get a survey done in order to get financing or anything like that?
It was a bankruptcy auction, and I never saw a survey. I don't know.
No, bank didn't ask.
The lessees, the people who never had a reason to get a survey done until you were trying to redevelop it for this purpose.
Considering redevelopment, correct?
Yeah.
Not even for the purpose of the lease agreement with the tenant?
No lease, no survey was required.
No, it was just a meets and bounds description, which was the same meets and bounds description
In the deed.
that was acquired from the bankruptcy court and that the bank took a mortgage on. It just never came to pass.
And so, I'm just trying to get sort of facts, background, I'm not, so when then you found out about that, was there an effort to not use the town property? In
Yes.
other words, you roped it off and you'd say, okay, well now that's the town side and we're only gonna stay on our side?
We informed United Rentals that there was an acre strip along the fence that did not belong to the landlord. That is correct.
Did United Rentals stop using that side of the property?
I can't
As far as I know, were there infractions? It wasn't monitored constantly, but as far as I know, they were not parking on that property.
And we made Mr. Saxel the fence tenant, and he was aware of the situation, we can keep it secret.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that you did. I'm just asking factually whether they in fact continued using it or not.
As far as I know, not, but it was, where they parked vehicles was not constantly monitored, so I can't say for sure.
But Barbara, the other thing I wanted to say, Mr. Carr will testify that, if we're focusing on the environmental condition of the subject property, the applicant's property, and that's another room here in terms of this application, because the property will be remediated to state standards. Again, a very positive thing, I think, for the town, the community, the surrounding neighborhood.
Well, true. I mean, is it also that the area of the town of Fairfield property is also contaminated?
I'm going to let Attorney Miller resume and address that. She's going to address it.
If I can just take one step back, I also want to reiterate that 185 Thorpe Street was so concerned that United Rentals as a tenant continue its good environmental stewardship of the property, that they actually hired Mr. Carr to go in periodically to do written environmental audits to make sure that United Rentals was properly handling all their equipment washing, all their equipment maintenance, and all their waste handling procedures.
And so concerned that they were not parking on the town of Fairfield property either.
Did Mr. Carr audit that? Not that I'm aware of.
Right.
But I was just concerned that there was some statement that for 17 years there was contamination going on at that property.
No, you made that point clear, and I understand that in the aspects that they wanted to monitor, they did an effective job, or so they think they, they purport to have done an effective job.
Right.
And they just didn't monitor whether their tenant was using town property.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Let's cut to the chase here on cleaning up the town property. Clearly, your predecessor in title illegally dumped on town property, and whether it's, landfill, hazardous waste, non-hazardous waste, bulky waste, whatever we're going to call it under the DEP reg, something was dumped on the town property, and your predecessor in title paved over the town property, used the town property, put a fence around it, and now I'm hearing that as part of your development, you're just going to leave the fill in the ground, and you're going to leave the asphalt on top and let the little weeds grow up through it over the decades. Is it your position that your client has no responsibility for remediating, cleaning, or restoring the town property that your predecessor utilized over the years?
If I could just put one nuance in there. Sure. If the operations conducted by McClinch Equipment or United Rentals had contaminated the town property, then the environmental law says that if there is contamination coming from your property onto somebody else's property, yes, you have to clean up.
Understood, but you're not suggesting that.
Well, and in fact, I'm saying testing was done, and that's not the case.
Right, that's my point. Your LEP is not suggesting you have groundwater effects coming on our property, or you have soil effects or impacts on our property, then otherwise you would be cleaning it up. So you're taking the position that the reason you're not touching the town property, you being the applicant, are not touching the town property or remediating it is because you had nothing to do with it since you bought the property and your predecessor encroached, if you will?
The applicant did not put fill on the property, they did not pave the property, they did not fence the property, they never owned the property, they occasionally parked vehicles on the property. I don't think there's a legal doctrine of you touch it, you own it, although I tried that on my little sisters when I was a kid. But as far as I know, in law school, there's no such doctrine. Would one claim adverse possession and have a good case? I don't know. But our client has never asserted that because they didn't know it wasn't their property.
You can't adverse possess against a municipality.
But that's what I'm saying. It was never their property. They never owned it. They never changed its nature.
To cut to the chase answer, the chase question is, Mr. Carr will, through his testimony report, document facts that are confirmatory of the fact that the applicant has not caused any pollution or contamination to the town's property. And the legal standard, as I understand it, and I defer to Attorney Miller, because it's her area of specialization, but I think it's what she just articulated, is if there is evidence that there is contamination on the town property that was caused partially or totally by the actions of this applicant, then under environmental law, there would be some responsibility on the part of the applicant to clean up the contamination they caused. That's not the case here. And therefore, I'll let Barbara explain, we determined it would not be legally or any otherwise appropriate for us to undertake,
digging out what somebody put there.
And that's fine. And maybe I think what we need to do is through the staff, is get our town attorney involved in this issue, and we need an answer to the question, the response, his opinion on the responsibility of the current property owner for the fill and paving activities, among other things, by the prior property owner. And number two, perhaps get our conservation department or our conservation director or an appropriate expert, if they need to retain one, involved to look at the environmental report provided by the applicant here to determine if they agree that there is no contamination effects on the town property. And number three, if in fact there's a proposal to leave the asphalt on the town property that was put there along with the fill, if the degradation of the asphalt over the years, as the grass grows through and as it breaks down, given that it is a petroleum-based product, if that will cause a damage or an impact to the waters of the state of Connecticut, which puts it under DEP jurisdiction, or the property of the town of Fairfield. And I think I have to answer that question, because we may then have a reason or a way to have this applicant address that issue. I think there are too many unknowns, and I'm assuming that their LEP
I have
is
something
going
to
to
add.
say that there is, well, I'm talking, I'm assuming that their LEP is going to say, from what was just suggested by Attorney Miller, that there are no impacts from the site to off-site properties, particularly the town of Fairfield property, the waters of the state of Connecticut, or the tidal areas. So I think those have to be looked at. I think we need to get our legal counsel and our conservation department perhaps involved as well. And I think some of you folks, I'll go left to right here to keep it simple if they want to add on
Mine
to
is
that.
quick, yeah. It's just a question for Attorney, just to clarify that, I don't understand all the issues of title and ownership, but I just want to clarify that. You said that through the bankruptcy proceedings in 1994, in effect, your client or whatever predecessor company purchased the property and for Clinch Equipment. But I thought you also said that you thought you owned the town property until about 5 or 6 years ago.
No, I'm saying they didn't know exactly where the border line was.
They didn't know where the border was.
Right.
But they thought they owned what was fenced in.
Right, I said, that's what I'm
That's
asking.
the
I said,
point.
did they think they...
Before what was fenced in, gentlemen? Yes, they did.
Okay, so here's my question.
Sure.
So, we're talking about like things that happened in 1959, 1960. I understand why you may not know exactly like how that happened, how that got there. My question is, how do we live from 1994 until about 2006 or 2007 that the applicant didn't do anything? He said this property needed remediation, that there were no operations of the applicant that adversely impacted the town property when they were unclear about that it was town property.
Right.
So how do we know that
Because it was,
no
well,
operations were done then to?
Because there were no operations done, because the United Rentals was monitored, because Mr. McClinch and Mr. Pearson worked there every day, they ran the company, because we had it audited, and because we tested those areas at the written request of Mr. Stanky in 2009 and 2011, there were borings and test pits done with the town's knowledge and permission, and the paving was properly replaced, and those tests revealed urban fill. If you want to take the last couple minutes of the hearing, I can try to give a slight bit of enlightenment on what urban fill is and what it means, and...
Yeah, and I appreciate that, but let's go around
Oh, okay.
clockwise here.
I'm sorry.
I think some of my colleagues wanted to add something at this point. I'm sorry, I just want to let Commissioner Jacobson, and then we'll...
Oh, sorry, I didn't...
Yeah, I just have a question. You have done test borings on your property that you own,
Yes.
and you have not found any contaminants that need to be excavated out of that property?
No, that's not true.
Okay.
And Mr. Carr will cover that.
Okay, because I'm concerned that during the excavation, the contaminants may leak onto town property, and like what's going to happen with the soil, but I'll let...
Those are all very good questions.
Carr will
We have
address that, I
Soil
assume.
management plan, and Mr. Carr has everything spelled out, and those are good questions, and he will address those in full.
Commissioner Wagner, then Alessi, then Neely.
Thanks. I just wanted to add to your request that, in the context of that review, number one, when they acquired it out of bankruptcy in '94, was that like a quit claim or some sort of, was there a legal operation that somehow, ended or any possible liability of the, acquirer for that which occurred on the land previously? I don't know the answer.
It certainly ended the liability of the lumber company that went bankrupt,
Well, the
but I
one that
think...
went bankrupt, but if someone acquires a property of bankruptcy and that property is contaminated, is it the responsibility of the new owner to clean up the contamination, right? And then number two,
That's a different question.
I'm not asking you the questions. I'm adding to our dialogue here with staff. And then number two, I'd just like it made clear that the town attorney should consider all of the factual issues surrounding this, including that it was fenced in, that it was used as part of the property, that, there was apparently an assumption that they owned that part of the property which was actually owned by the town of Fairfield, and how that would play into their responsibility for the contamination that's there.
Thank you. Commissioner Alessi?
Attorney Miller, what you're trying to say to us is that the owner didn't know if the property was theirs or not, and that they didn't use it, or they did use it?
They parked vehicles on it.
Okay.
Commissioner Neely?
And I
Sorry.
just wanted to clarify, there is no question, unless you've gone through some DEP program, when a company buys property from a bankrupt company and it's contaminated and you want to develop it, that property owner within the metes and bounds of the property that he bought from the bankruptcy court is absolutely required to clean it up. We've done an environmental study, we have a remediation plan, and there's no shirking that which was bought from the bankruptcy court should and will be cleaned up.
I just, I own commercial properties, and I just don't know, after 17 years of not knowing where my property line is, just seems incredulous. I just don't understand how that happens, especially when you're renting something to a major corporation, a public corporation, and we don't spell out in the lease where the boundaries are and how many square footage we have, or where the property line ends, or where it begins, or... Yeah, I'm sure you were charging. I don't understand that a survey has never been done on a piece of property, and we did, a lease was drawn up with a major public corporation. I just don't understand how that takes place. To me, I've never seen that before in my 25 years in being in business.
All I can tell you is it happened, and there were some big New York firms involved, and there's meets and bounds description, and there's a square footage, and there was no survey required, and that's what happened.
Were the meets and bounds described like where the fence ends and across laterally to the fence? Was the fence
Not
described
that
in the
I'm
meets and
aware of,
bounds?
but I'd be happy to get town council a copy of the deed that we got from the bankruptcy court. I'm more than happy to do that.
It might be interesting to look at.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just was wanting to talk, it seems to me, obviously, you take it, that the questions for the town attorney are twofold. One of which I think Attorney Miller has already answered, with the focus being on responsibilities of the applicant to remediate the property that we know they own now, that is subject to this application. I think she's correctly stated the law. I mean, you got to remediate. It doesn't matter if you got it in bankruptcy or not. I think the question that's on the commission's mind right now, and that you're asking the town attorney, is what is the standard of liability for this applicant with respect to a legal responsibility to remediate any contamination that may exist on the town property?
No, I actually disagree with your recharacterization of what my inquiry was.
Well, I didn't say what your inquiry was, I said what I think the inquiry should be.
Okay, well, I disagree with it that's what the inquiry should be. They took a property out of bankruptcy court. There should be no question that the property is contaminated. The prior owner used property that the town owned, and I think it's a reasonable inference that the same action which contaminated the subject property also caused the contamination on the town property. You might disagree with me on that, but I think given where we are and the activity and so forth, I think it's a reasonable inference that the same conduct caused the contamination both on the applicant's property as well as the town's property. The distinction being made here by the applicant is that because there was a misunderstanding about where the property line began and ended, that now, because the applicant entity did not cause any further contamination, that its responsibility is only to clean up that which exists on the applicant's property, which has now been surveyed, and they can disregard the contamination that was caused by their predecessor to the town's property.
Stated that way, I think that's an appropriate question to take to the town attorney. The question is...
I appreciate your answering my question.
I'm just giving my, since it reflects my client's right, I think I should have an opportunity to respond to your framing of the issue, which I think I agree with. The question is, what is the standard by which the applicant would be responsible for actions of its predecessor relative?
Yeah, I think it's fair, and that question should reasonably take into account the specific facts of this scenario. That in fact they thought they were acquiring that piece, that in fact they used that piece of land for X period of time, and so forth. That was the basis of my inquiry.
Now, Commissioner Neely.
We're on the same page.
Yes, it is.
So, my understanding that you're saying that when the applicant purchased this property, he did not know the property lines and that the town-owned property was part of the property he purchased. No, when he bought the property, he assumed he owned up to the fence, but in fact, he didn't own up to the fence. There was a piece of town property between what he owned and the fence. Does that make it any clear?
No, it doesn't make any sense to me, because usually when you purchase a property, you get a property description, and you get a plot plan, and you know what you're buying. And how could you not know where your boundaries are? That's what I don't understand.
I wasn't there, but I'll try to explain as best I can. There was no plot plan, there was no survey.
How could you purchase a piece of property without knowing your boundaries and having a plot plan?
Because there was a bankruptcy auction, and basically they say, here's the property, here's a meets and bounds description, what are you going to pay for it, it's approved, and you're in and out.
That doesn't make any sense to me.
That's what happened.
Mr. Parker, then Commissioner Cannelli.
Okay. My concern about all this is you're saying that there is an end to this legal responsibility, and yet you purchased a property that may have been contaminated by Fairfield lumber with pressure-treated lumber and all sorts of chemicals on hand. I assume some of that leached into the soil, which in turn, with the flow of water, would end up on town property as well. And you're claiming no legal responsibility?
No, I'm not claiming that. That's not what I said, and I'll try to repeat again.
You're claiming that you'd have legal responsibility, but you don't because the impacts on your site did not affect an off-site source, specifically the town's property, correct?
What I'm saying is, on the town property, there's urban fill, and you'll have to wait for another night on my dissertation on what urban fill is, because I wouldn't call it contamination, I would call it not clean fill, but in fact, Mr. Carr will describe in detail that the operations of the lumber company and the operations of the equipment companies did not cause contamination on the town property, and you have to be satisfied that he's explained it and done thorough testing. But it's very important that that was done.
Has he done?
Well, they have, but that's what I wanted to talk about.
That's in his environmental report, so he'll testify about his phase 1, phase 2.
Lots of testing,
Quick,
but
we've got
your
2
point
minutes
is
here.
absolutely right.
But Mr. Carr's testimony, I think, will be helpful in you guys.
Commissioner Cannelli.
Thanks very much. I want to just quickly go to 2011, if I could, Attorney Miller. Just and because, with all due respect to the concerns raised by Attorney Fallon about the letter from Mr. Stanky, I'm referencing that letter. And just a moment ago, before this last discussion, you mentioned that you were invited onto the town property to do testing, or at the very least you had the approvals of the town to do this testing. And I'm going to read to you a passage, 2 paragraphs, from Mr. Stanky. By this time, 2011, the town property had been filled, fenced, paved, and polluted. But the contaminants were isolated beneath the pavement until the applicant brought its excavator, a Cat 312B with a 14-foot boom and bucket, and proceeded to excavate throughout the town property 12 observation and sampling pits, each about 5 feet square and 5 feet deep, producing nearly 50 cubic yards of potentially contaminated soils with no indication of how the material was disposed. Presumably, the applicant backfilled the holes, leaving the contaminated surface soils exposed to runoff, erosion, and open space visitors on to open space visitors on the town property. Now, the important point. The applicant did not request or receive Conservation Commission approval or hold the town harmless when conducting its investigations on town property, nor has the applicant disclosed its town property findings to the town or included such findings in the present application before the TPZ. I'm sorry, there seems to be a disconnect between Mr. Stanky, who usually is responsible for approving these things, and what you've described. So could you explain?
And maybe that's an excellent question.
Why don't I bring the documentation to our next meeting?
I'm just going to suggest maybe we start the next meeting. Commissioner Suter had one question, but perhaps we start the next meeting with an answer to that, and you could...
You did say you're going to give us a copy of the deed that was issued by the trustee in bankruptcy.
If you'd like to see that, sure, I'd be happy to.
If you could provide that to the
Or
next
if you
meeting.
want me to give it to town council, whatever's...
No, provide it to staff.
I'm just concerned about how it is that the conservation director and the applicant have two very different views of what happened in 2011, let alone 1992 or 95.
I have written memorandum ordering the testing, and I'd be happy to share them.
I'll leave that hanging, and I'm
Sure.
going to give this, and Mr. Wendt can distribute it to you. In fairness, Mr. Canelli.
Sure.
There's a concept review from Mr. Stanky dated May 1, 2009. Sorry. There's a concept review dated May 1, 2009 from Mr. Stanky. It is voluminous.
Right.
But if you look on page 5 of that document,
Okay.
it says, and I quote, "Please provide reports and plans of all subsurface investigations on site. Provide representative borings or test hole data through all fill, peat, and muck strata to document subsurface conditions on the filled properties of the church and the town." So when we went on the property, we went on the property at the specific request to provide this information as part of a concept review that we had submitted for the project.
Well, I think that perhaps what he's suggesting is that even though he, in that review, he said that that would have to be done, so subsequently from that report, was there an application or a request for permission to actually go and do that, or did the applicant just take it upon himself to just go do it?
We did it because it simply said, provide, this meant in response to the concept review, provide representative borings or test hole data through all fill, peat, and muck strata to document subsurface conditions on the filled properties of the church and the town. If you read into that...
I understand your point. I understand your point.
I think we were trying to respond.
Right.
So there were a litany of things that we requested to respond to in this, which you will have a copy of. I'll give it to Mr. White.
And which we will discuss.
And I think that Mr. Stanky's point was that if there was a request for permission to actually go and do what you did, he would have said, you gotta have a silt line, you gotta have this, you gotta have that, and how are you gonna dispose of the fill, what, you know, a plan for actually conducting the test.
When you read in the context, that's concept review, Commissioner Wagner, all of it.
All that's laid out.
And then that line, if that's the conclusion you reach, then I would say, well, you know, but I don't think if you were an attorney you would say, boy, we gotta get Mr. Stanky all this information.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
this is one component of it.
Well, and also, I would encourage you next time around to ask Mr. Carr, who supervised the testing, his reaction to the statements about any carelessness or mishandling.
No, I appreciate that, because, you know, I asked that of Mr. Yantos as well, and it was a very, very simple question, you know, whether Mr. Stanky had just got it wrong, just missed it.
I think he did, and I think Mr. Carr
And on that
can
note,
that.
we are going to stand in adjournment. We've reached the curfew. They have to close the building, and we will see you next Tuesday, 7:30. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.